Hi guys. Tonight we step into a night where the sky feels heavier than usual, where snow presses downward as if it means to seal the world shut. You are standing at the edge of an open plain, the wind already worrying at your coat, already finding the gaps you forgot to close. Somewhere behind you is the idea of a home. Ahead of you is a winter that does not care about ideas. The air smells sharp and metallic, like frozen iron, and every breath feels borrowed. You probably won't survive this if you treat it casually. That is the quiet truth no one prints on the posters. Winter on the early American frontier is not dramatic in the way stories promise. It does not roar all at once. It accumulates. It settles. It convinces you, inch by inch, that the land itself has decided to wait you out. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Night has a way of connecting people who are far apart. Now, dim the lights, and let the story carry you forward. You feel the storm before you see it. The wind shifts direction, low and insistent, bringing with it the faint hiss of snow moving across hard ground. Early pioneers often described this sound as a warning, though not everyone listened. Mainstream historical accounts tell us that sudden winter storms on the Great Plains and frontier regions could arrive with little notice, turning mild days into white confusion within hours. Weather records were non-existent, and clouds were read more by instinct than science. Your boots crunch, then soften as snow deepens. Each step takes more effort than the last. The land is open here, brutally honest, offering no trees thick enough to break the wind. The cold is not yet painful. It is patient. It waits at the edges of your fingers, your ears, your nose, testing how long you plan to ignore it. Some pioneers believed that if they kept moving, they could outrun the storm. Letters and diaries suggest this confidence often came from older European experiences, where forests and villages were closer together. But historians still argue whether that optimism was courage or simple misunderstanding of the American climate. Either way, movement becomes harder as visibility shrinks. The horizon dissolves. Up and down lose their meaning. You stop not because you want to, but because your body insists. Sound changes first. The wind dulls. Snow absorbs noise until even your breathing feels too loud. This silence is not peaceful. It is thick, padded, and vaguely threatening. Like being underwater. It is here that the idea of going underground begins to form, not as strategy, but as instinct. The earth beneath your feet does not scream. It does not move. It holds a steady, muted cold that feels almost kind compared to the slicing air above. Modern science explains that soil maintains a relatively stable temperature below the frost line, but you do not know that yet. You only know that when you kneel and press your glove against the ground. It does not bite back. A quirky detail from frontier journals mentions settlers noticing that animal burrows remained free of ice long after storms passed. Rabbits, foxes, even snakes seemed to understand something humans were still learning. Some pioneers mocked the idea of hiding like animals. Others paid attention. Survival often belonged to the second group. The first shovelful of earth is always the hardest. Frozen soil resists like packed stone, and the sound of metal striking ground rings sharply in the quiet. Your arms burn quickly. Sweat forms beneath layers that moments ago felt insufficient. The smell of dirt rises, damp and oddly comforting, reminding you of warmer seasons you are trying not to think about. As you dig, time stretches. Snow piles behind you faster than you can clear it. This is another mainstream fact often overlooked. Snowfall rates during frontier blizzards could exceed several inches per hour, meaning any surface structure risked being buried before it was finished. Underground. At least, the snow works for you instead of against you. Piling on top as insulation. You pause to breathe. Leaning on the shovel handle, the wind still howls above. But it feels farther away now, like a bad memory already losing its edge. The hole you've started is small, unimpressive, but it offers something priceless: separation. Historians still debate how intentional these early underground shelters were. Some argue they were desperate improvisations, others that they represented a deliberate adaptation based on observation and shared knowledge. The truth likely sits somewhere in between, shaped by panic, insight, and exhaustion. You lower yourself into the shallow pit, curling your body instinctively to preserve heat. The ground presses against your back, firm and cold but steady. The soundscape changes again. Wind becomes a distant murmur. Snowfall turns into a soft, constant whisper above you. Your own heartbeat grows louder in your ears, slow and heavy. There is fear here. Yes, but it is quieter than the fear above ground. This fear is contained. It has edges you can understand. You pull earth closer, packing it loosely to block drafts, leaving just enough space for air. Ventilation is a gamble. Pioneers often misunderstood. A few inches too sealed. And warmth becomes danger. Too open. And cold reclaims the space. That balance will haunt frontier survival stories for decades. A fringe anecdote from a Midwestern settlement describes settlers using hollowed-out gourds as makeshift air tubes, angling them toward the surface to draw in fresh air without letting snow fall directly inside. It sounds clever, and maybe it was, or maybe it only worked once. Records are frustratingly quiet on how often such tricks succeeded. As minutes pass, your breathing steadies. The ground smells rich now, almost sweet beneath the frost. It reminds you that life continues below, even when the surface world looks dead. Roots sleep here. Insects wait. Seeds hold their breath. You are not alone in hiding. Your muscles begin to relax despite the cold. This is dangerous and comforting at the same time. Early settlers often misjudged this calm, mistaking it for safety rather than the body conserving energy. Still, without this pause, survival would be impossible. Above you, the storm continues its work, reshaping the land without asking permission. Down here, time slows. Thoughts wander. You think of the cabin you meant to build, the walls that would have stood proud if you'd had one more week. You think of neighbors scattered miles away, each making their own decisions under the same sky. This first choice, to trust the earth, marks a turning point you may not fully understand yet. It is not heroic. It is not even particularly hopeful. It is practical. It is quiet. And it is the reason you are still breathing as the night deepens. The ground does not promise comfort. It offers consistency. In a world where wind erases tracks and snow buries mistakes, consistency is enough. The storm does not pass the way storms do in stories. There is no dramatic break, no sudden clearing of the sky. Instead, it settles in, hour after hour, like a decision that has already been made. You wake without truly waking, unsure how long you've been curled against the packed earth, unsure whether sleep ever fully arrived. Your body aches in a dull, spread-out way, as if the cold has gently rearranged everything inside you. Above you, snow keeps falling. You can hear it now, not as individual flakes, but as weight. A soft, constant pressure pressing down on the ground overhead. This is one of those mainstream realities of frontier winters that often gets softened in retellings. Many early storms did not last minutes or even hours, but days. Snowfall combined with relentless wind created drifts higher than fences, sometimes higher than cabins themselves. You shift your legs carefully. Movement feels expensive. Every motion costs warmth, and warmth has become your most valuable currency. You remember thinking that digging underground was a temporary solution, just a pause, a way to wait out the worst of it. But the storm is teaching you something else now. Waiting may take longer than planned. When you press your palm against the earth wall, it feels almost unchanged from before. Cold, yes, but steady, not the knife-edge cold of open air. This is where pioneers began to notice the difference between exposure and endurance. Above ground, The cold attacks. Below ground, it negotiates. Some settlers kept rough tallies of storm duration, scratching marks into wood or stone. Others abandoned the idea entirely once the sun disappeared. Historians still argue whether people actually lost track of days during major blizzards, or whether later accounts exaggerated the disorientation. Either way, time here feels elastic. Morning and night blur together, marked only by hunger and fatigue. You reach for the small bundle of food you brought down with you. It is less than you hoped. Dried meat, hard bread, maybe a scrap of fat wrapped in cloth. You chew slowly, not for pleasure, but for warmth. Eating becomes a form of internal fire. Frontier diaries consistently note how cold dulls appetite, even as the body desperately needs calories. That contradiction confuses many first-timers. A strange detail appears in several accounts from the northern plains. Some pioneers claimed food tasted different underground. Earthier, muted. Whether that was psychological or the result of cold-numbed senses remains unclear. But perception shifts when your world shrinks to a hole in the ground. The wind above intensifies. And for a moment, you worry the roof of packed soil might fail. Snow loads were unpredictable. Entire cabins collapsed under their weight during severe winters. Underground shelters were not immune either. Too shallow, and the ceiling could cave in. Too deep, and digging became impossible in frozen ground. Finding the right depth was more art than science. You listen carefully. The earth creaks faintly, a sound more felt than heard. It is not alarming yet, just a reminder that this shelter is borrowed, not owned. Early pioneers often spoke of the psychological shift that came with storms like this. At first, there was urgency, plans, lists of tasks. Then, gradually, a narrowing of focus. Stay warm. Stay breathing. Everything else could wait. This mental compression was as important as physical shelter. Those who continued to think in long timelines often made dangerous decisions. You adjust the opening you left for air, brushing away snow that has begun to creep inward. Ventilation again. Always ventilation. There are tragic stories, quietly recorded, of settlers who survived the cold only to lose consciousness from smoke or stale air. Some used small oil lamps or smouldering embers underground, believing the heat worth the risk. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. Historians still debate how widespread such practices were, since many incidents left no survivors to explain what went wrong. The storm continues to press down, and you begin to notice something unexpected. The underground space feels smaller, not physically, but mentally. Your thoughts bounce off invisible walls. You replay memories with unusual clarity. Warm kitchens, summer insects, the sound of water moving freely. This is another quiet challenge of underground survival, rarely emphasized in mainstream narratives. Isolation amplifies memory. You try to sleep again, pulling fabric tighter around your shoulders. The ground pulls heat steadily from your body, and you shift to keep blood moving. Pioneers learned quickly that stillness could be deadly, even underground. Circulation mattered. Wiggle toes, flex fingers, small rituals to keep life flowing. A quirky frontier belief suggested that speaking aloud, even to no one, helped prevent freezing to death. The idea was that sound meant breath, and breath meant life. Whether this actually helped or simply calmed panic is unclear, but journals mention whispered prayers, songs, and even arguments conducted in the dark. You find yourself murmuring now. Not words exactly, just sound, proof that you are still here. At some point, hunger sharpens. Your stomach complains more loudly than before, a hollow ache that radiates outward. This is another lesson early settlers learned the hard way. Cold burns calories relentlessly. Even resting, your body consumes fuel at alarming speed. Underground shelter slows heat loss, but it does not stop the internal furnace. You ration carefully. One bite now, one later, stretching what you have. Root cellars and buried food caches existed for this reason. but reaching them during a storm was often impossible. Snow erased landmarks. Paths vanished. More than one pioneer froze within sight of their own supplies. Above you, the storm finally begins to shift. Not end, just change. The sound of wind lowers in pitch. Snowfall lightens. You sense it before you can confirm it. The earth transmits these changes subtly, like a pulse. This sensitivity becomes second nature to those who survive multiple winters. The ground tells stories if you listen long enough. You wait. Patience becomes your final test. Emerging too soon could mean stepping into whiteout conditions. Waiting too long risks weakness and disorientation. There is no perfect moment, only a least bad one. Historians still argue how pioneers made these decisions without modern information. Luck played a role. Experience too. And sometimes, stubbornness disguised as intuition. Eventually, you push upward gently, testing resistance. Snow has packed densely above, heavier than before. Digging out will take effort, but the air feels different now, less sharp, less angry. You pause, conserving strength, knowing the storm has not beaten you yet, but it may have loosened its grip. For now, underground has done its job. It has bought you time, and on the frontier, time is often the only thing standing between survival and becoming another unmarked story swallowed by winter. Cold does not announce itself with drama. It arrives quietly, the way fatigue does, slipping past your attention until something feels off. You notice it first in your fingers. They do not hurt. That would be easier. Instead, they feel distant, as if they belong to someone else. You flex them slowly, watching the movement with mild curiosity, as though observing rather than inhabiting your own body. This is how winter wins when people misunderstand it. Those who lived through frontier winters eventually recognized a simple truth that shows up again and again in surviving letters and recollections. The most dangerous cold is not the sharp, screaming kind, but the steady, patient kind. The cold that allows you to think you are fine, while it quietly rearranges how your body works. Long before thermometers were common, people understood this through experience alone. You shift deeper into your underground shelter, pressing your shoulders against the soil. The earth holds you in a way the wind never did. Still cold, but not aggressive. Your breath fogs faintly in the dim space, then settles. You listen to it. Slow breathing becomes an anchor. Too fast, and panic burns precious warmth. Too slow, and drowsiness creeps closer than it should. Drowsiness is the real danger here. Frontier survivors often wrote about an overwhelming urge to sleep during extreme cold, describing it not as exhaustion, but as comfort, a softness, a sense that rest would solve everything. What they were describing, though they didn't know the term, was the body's response to dropping core temperature. Modern understanding explains it clearly now. But back then, it felt like temptation rather than warning. You fight it by moving. Not much, just enough. Toes curl and uncurl. Knees draw up. Then extend again. Small motions. Almost invisible. People who survived learned that stillness was not peace. Stillness was surrender. A small, easily overlooked note from a frontier diary mentions a man who survived a blizzard simply by counting movements. 10 finger flexes, 10 breaths, 10 toe wiggles. Over and over. Through the night. It sounds obsessive, but repetition creates time where none seems to exist. Your stomach tightens again. Hunger and cold blend into a single sensation now. A hollow ache that seems to live behind your ribs. Eating helps, but only briefly. The warmth it provides is fleeting, like striking a match in a storm. Still, pioneers learned to use food strategically, not just to survive, but to stay awake. A small bite could sharpen the senses just enough to push back the fog. You break off another piece of dried meat, chewing slowly. Your jaw works harder than usual. Everything feels thicker down here. heavier. Even sound moves sluggishly. When snow slides somewhere above, it reaches you as a dull vibration rather than a noise. The world feels padded, wrapped in layers you can't see. This muted environment changes perception in subtle ways. People reported losing track of their own bodies, feeling as though they were shrinking or expanding in the dark. Some later accounts suggest this was fear talking. Others believe it was sensory deprivation doing its quiet work. There's no clear agreement, only repetition of the experience itself. You test your fingers again. Sensation is still there, dull, but present. That matters. You remind yourself of it. Staying aware becomes a job in itself. Cold also changes how pain behaves. Instead of sharp signals, everything blurs. Scrapes go unnoticed. Pressure replaces sting. This is why people sometimes made catastrophic decisions without realizing it. Walking too far, resting too long, removing gloves for tasks that felt urgent but weren't. You think briefly of the world above, of wind scraping snow into shapes that will vanish by morning, of fences buried, paths erased, of cabins standing silent, their doors sealed by drifts. The storm is still working, even if you can't hear it clearly anymore. A curious observation appears in several winter accounts. People underground often felt safer than they actually were. The absence of wind tricked the mind into relaxing too much. This false sense of security could be just as dangerous as panic. Survivors learned to respect the cold even when it seemed quieter. You reach up to clear your air gap again, brushing snow aside. The opening feels narrower now, packed tighter. You widen it slightly, careful not to let loose snow spill in. Air flows faintly, cold, clean, necessary. The balance between warmth and oxygen is thin, and you walk it without knowing exactly where the edge lies. Some pioneers believed cold air itself was healthier than warm. Stale air, even underground. They deliberately kept ventilation open wider than comfort allowed. Others sealed themselves in tightly, prioritizing warmth. Outcomes varied. Later interpretations disagree on which approach was more common or more successful. Survival often came down to small differences, compounded over hours. Your thoughts slow again. You catch yourself drifting, imagining warmth too vividly. This is another trap. Memory becomes seductive. You gently pull yourself back by focusing on the present. The smell of soil, the texture of cloth against skin, the faint sound of your own breathing. You whisper something. Not a prayer exactly, just words. Your voice sounds strange in the small space, swallowed quickly by dirt. Still, it helps. Sound confirms existence. People noticed this long before psychologists named it grounding. As the hours stretch on, your body adapts in small ways. Shivering comes and goes. Muscles tense. Then relax. Heat redistributes. You are no longer warm. But you are no longer declining as quickly either. Underground shelter doesn't save you outright. It slows the loss enough for endurance to matter. That distinction is everything. There's a lingering question woven through many frontier survival stories. How close to death were people before they realized it, without instruments or clear markers? Awareness came late. Some survived because they acted early. Others survived because they didn't realize how bad things were and kept moving out of stubborn habit. Which mattered more remains unclear. Eventually, fatigue settles into a manageable hum rather than a wave. You learn its rhythm. You work with it instead of against it. Short rests, gentle movement, controlled breathing. This is not comfort. It is maintenance. Above you, the storm continues, reshaping the land. But underground, your world has narrowed to essentials: air, heat, awareness. Everything else has been stripped away. Cold kills quietly, but it does not have to kill quickly. That is the lesson pioneers learned the hard way. Bodies pressed to soil, waiting out storms one breath at a time. The problem with wooden walls is not that they fail all at once, it is that they fail politely. Slowly, pretending everything is still under control long after it isn't. You remember how solid a cabin feels when it is new, the way the logs fit together, the reassuring weight of them. But winter does not test strength. It tests endurance. And wood, for all its virtues, leaks time. Frontier settlers learned this lesson through long nights rather than sudden disaster. Letters from homesteads describe cabins that seemed warm enough at dusk, only to feel hollow and brittle by morning. Heat slipped out through seams no one could see. Wind found its way through corners thought to be sealed. Snow stacked against walls, then crept inside as melt and refreeze worked like a patient wedge. You imagine yourself inside such a cabin now. The fire burns, but it demands feeding. Wood disappears faster than expected. Every trip outside to gather more feels riskier than the last. Snow hides landmarks. Wind steals breath. Even reaching a woodpile 20 steps away becomes an expedition. This is where underground shelter begins to make sense in a way cabins often could not during prolonged storms. Above ground, survival required constant input, fuel, repairs, vigilance. Below ground, the environment stabilized. Not warm, but predictable. The earth did not demand tending. It simply existed. What stands out in many pioneer accounts is how quickly people noticed this difference once they experienced both. A few describe abandoning cabins mid-storm, crawling into dugouts or cellars when the fire could no longer keep up. That decision was rarely made lightly. Leaving a structure you built with your own hands feels like admitting failure. But winter has no interest in pride. You think about the sound difference. In a cabin, wind roars, logs groan, roof beams creak under weight. Every noise suggests collapse might be moments away. Underground, sound dulls. The storm still exists, but it loses its voice. That silence carries a strange authority. It tells your nervous system to slow down. There's an easily missed observation tucked into a settler's journal from the Dakotas. The writer notes that his family slept better underground, even when conditions were objectively worse. Less space, less light, less air, yet rest came more easily. Fear, it seems, burned more calories than cold ever did. That does not mean cabins were useless. Far from it. In moderate winters, a well-built cabin offered comfort no hole in the ground ever could. Raised floors stayed dry. Chimneys carried smoke away. Windows let in light. But in truly severe storms, those advantages turned fragile. Chimneys clogged with snow. Roofs collapsed under weight. Windows became points of failure instead of relief. Some families tried hybrid solutions. Half-dug cabins, sod houses reinforced with timber. These designs blurred the line between underground and above-ground living. Their success varied widely depending on soil type, snowfall, and construction skill. Later observers struggled to categorize them, which is why records sometimes contradict one another. You shift in your underground shelter again, feeling the soil press back. This pressure, steady and unmoving, becomes oddly reassuring. Above ground, wind pushes. Below ground, the earth holds. That difference shapes how your body responds. Muscles unclench, breathing evens out. Still, underground shelter carries its own dangers. Moisture seeps in. Condensation forms where warm breath meets cold walls. Clothing dampens. If you stop moving too long, chill settles deep into bone. Cabins, at least, offered dry space when fires burned well. This trade-off haunted pioneer decisions all winter long. There's a quiet disagreement among later historians about how often underground shelters were used as primary winter homes versus emergency refuges. Some evidence suggests entire families lived below ground for months at a time. Other records imply short-term use during storms only. The truth likely depended on circumstance more than culture. People adapted to what worked, not what looked respectable. You imagine emerging briefly into a cabin during a lull, the door half buried, snow piled high against the walls, insulating and threatening at the same time. Inside, the air feels colder than expected. Smoke hangs low. The fire struggles. You realize the cabin no longer offers what it once did. That moment, when shelter loses its promise, marks a shift in thinking. You stop asking where you want to live and start asking where you can last. Comfort becomes secondary to consistency. One unusual practice mentioned in a handful of accounts involves deliberately letting cabins freeze solid, abandoning them temporarily while families retreated underground nearby. The idea was to preserve the structure by preventing thaw and freeze damage. It sounds counterintuitive, but the logic appears again and again. Whether it worked reliably remains unclear, but the strategy shows how flexible survival thinking became. You return mentally to your underground space. The air is still, cold, but not shifting. You no longer have to fight drafts. You are not feeding a fire. You are not listening for the crack of stressed timber. Your only task is awareness. That simplicity matters more than it should. Winter exhaustion often came not from cold alone, but from decision fatigue. Constant judgment calls. Should you add wood, patch a gap, clear the roof? Each choice cost energy. Underground. Choices narrowed. Stay still. Breathe. Move occasionally. Wait. This narrowing of life had psychological effects. Some settlers later described underground winters as strangely peaceful in retrospect. Despite the hardship, others remembered claustrophobia, fear, and long stretches of near panic. Memory softened or sharpened these experiences depending on outcome. Survival colored everything. You sensed that if you had stayed above ground too long, your body would have burned itself out trying to keep up. Underground shelter doesn't defeat winter. It lets winter pass while you remain. That distinction shaped frontier architecture in subtle ways. Dugouts, storm cellars, root cellars built deeper than necessary. Even as cabins improved, the habit of digging never disappeared. People learned not to trust a single layer between themselves and the weather. As you rest against the earth, the storm still present but distant, you understand why wood alone was never enough. It stood between you and the cold, but only briefly. The ground, indifferent and heavy, offers something sturdier, not warmth, time. And sometimes, time is the strongest material a pioneer has. You begin to notice something subtle as the hours pass, something that doesn't announce itself, but slowly makes itself known. The ground beneath you does not grow colder. It stays nearly the same, hour after hour, as if it exists outside the storm entirely. Above you, winter rages. Down here, the earth remembers something older than weather. People living on the frontier didn't have numbers for this. No charts or measurements. What they had was comparison. They knew how fast fingers numbed in open air. They knew how quickly breath turned shallow in the wind. Underground, those changes slowed, not stopped. Slowed, and that difference meant survival. You press your palm flat against the soil again. It is cold. Yes, but not changing. This steadiness becomes your reference point. When everything else feels uncertain, the ground offers a baseline. Early settlers learned to trust that baseline in ways that reshaped how they built, traveled, and waited out storms. Accounts from multiple regions quietly agree on this point: soil, once below the frost line, resists dramatic temperature swings. Settlers may not have known why, but they knew it worked. Dugouts, storm pits, and deep cellars weren't just hiding places. They were thermal anchors. You shift your weight and feel how the cold behaves differently against your body. Wind steals heat aggressively, stripping it layer by layer. The earth draws warmth more slowly, like a steady exchange rather than a theft. It is still dangerous, but predictable danger can be managed. This predictability shapes behavior. Instead of constant movement to fight, biting cold, you can rest more deeply here. Muscles unclench, breath slows. The body conserves instead of reacts. That conservation is everything during long winters. There's a small, easily overlooked pattern in frontier journals that supports this. People underground often described fewer injuries, fewer frostbitten ears, fewer cracked lips, less snow blindness. These weren't dramatic victories, just quiet advantages that added up over time. You realize that the earth does something else too. It blocks sound. The storm above fades into a distant presence, like a memory rather than a threat. This changes how fear behaves. Fear thrives on noise and motion. Take those away, and it loses some of its grip. Still, the ground is not gentle. Moisture seeps through it relentlessly. Your breath adds dampness to the air. Clothing grows heavier. Cold becomes clingy instead of sharp. Settlers learned quickly that damp cold could be just as dangerous as wind, especially when combined with exhaustion. Some families lined their dugouts with wood scraps, hides, even woven grass to create a barrier between skin and soil. Others relied on layers of bedding or straw. Results varied wildly. In some cases, insulation helped. In others, it trapped moisture and made conditions worse. No single solution worked everywhere. This uncertainty shows up repeatedly in later analysis. There's no firm agreement on the best underground design because conditions changed from place to place. Clay behaved differently than sand. Prairie soil behaved differently than mountain earth. What saved one family could endanger another. You adjust your position again. Mindful of contact points. Shoulder, hip, back. You rotate them slowly, spreading cold exposure instead of letting it concentrate. This instinctive behavior appears in several survival narratives. Even though no one explains it explicitly, people learn to distribute discomfort rather than endure it in one place. A curious note from a Nebraska settler mentions placing heated stones near sleeping areas underground. Wrapped in cloth, the stones offered warmth for hours without smoke or flame. Sometimes this worked beautifully. Sometimes the stones cracked, releasing steam or burning fabric. It was a gamble. Like so many frontier solutions, you listen to your own breathing. The sound feels close, amplified by the small space. You keep it steady. Rapid breathing wastes warmth. Shallow breathing invites panic. Finding the middle ground becomes a skill, practiced without instruction. The earth also changes how light behaves. If you have any source at all, a candle, stub, or lamp, it glows softly rather than flickering wildly. Shadows move less. The space feels contained. That containment calms some people and unsettles others. Claustrophobia appears often in underground accounts, especially among those unused to tight spaces. Yet many settlers grew to prefer it. They described the surface world as exposed, noisy, exhausting. Underground felt sheltered, even when uncomfortable. This preference surprises modern readers, but it makes sense when exposure equals risk. There's a lingering question woven through historical interpretation. Did pioneers fully understand why underground shelter worked? Or did they simply accept that it did? Some argue knowledge spread through observation and repetition. Others suggest deeper intuition at play, borrowed from older traditions or indigenous practices that emphasized earth-based shelter. What's clear is that once people trusted the ground, they returned to it again and again, storm after storm, winter after winter. Even as cabins improved, dugouts remained part of the survival toolkit. You notice hunger easing slightly, replaced by a dull steadiness. Your body has shifted modes. Instead of fighting cold, it's managing it. That shift doesn't guarantee survival, but it extends your margin. It buys you hours, sometimes days. Outside, snow continues to insulate the surface, trapping cold air above while stabilizing conditions below. This accidental layering works in your favor. Snow, destructive above ground, becomes protection underground. You rest your head back carefully, mindful of dampness. You let your eyes close briefly, not to sleep deeply, but to rest. You remain aware of breath, of temperature, of time passing slowly. This balance between rest and vigilance defines underground winter survival. The ground does not save you outright. It does not offer comfort or warmth. What it offers is something quieter and, in many ways, more powerful. It offers consistency when everything else is in motion. As long as that consistency holds, you have something to work with. And on the frontier, that is often enough. What you are doing now does not feel new, even though you have never done it before. As you settle deeper into the earth, a quiet recognition forms. This way of surviving winter has been practiced long before you arrived here, long before wagons cut lines across the plains. The idea did not originate with you, or even with the frontier. It was carried, reshaped, borrowed, and adapted. People who crossed the Atlantic brought fragments of memory with them, not always consciously. In parts of northern Europe, families once sheltered livestock and people together in earth-banked homes during harsh seasons. Cellars were not just for storage, but for living when surface rooms became unbearable. You may not remember these traditions directly, but they linger in habits, in instincts that surface when conditions turn dangerous. As you press your back against the soil, that inheritance makes itself known. Settlers quickly noticed that those with experience in colder climates adapted faster. They dug sooner. They dug deeper. They worried less about appearances and more about results. Frontier letters mention neighbors who mocked underground living at first, only to copy it after their first brutal winter. Pride, it turns out, freezes faster than common sense. But European memory was only part of the story. Long before settlers arrived, indigenous communities across North America had already mastered the logic of earth shelter. Semi-subterranean homes, earth lodges, and winter pits were carefully designed to manage cold, wind, and scarcity. These structures were not emergency measures. They were seasonal solutions, refined over generations. You may not have learned directly from those who came before, but knowledge has a way of leaking across boundaries, settlers observed. They asked questions. Sometimes they copied without understanding why something worked. Other times, they adapted pieces, blending unfamiliar methods with what they already knew. This blending shows up clearly in early frontier architecture. Dugouts reinforced with timber, sod houses shaped like cabins but half buried, storm cellars dug deeper than food storage required. These weren't accidents. They were experiments, conducted under pressure, with survival as the only acceptable outcome. There's an understated detail that appears in several early descriptions. People began digging not only for shelter, but for reassurance. The act itself mattered. Cutting into the ground created a sense of control when the environment felt overwhelming, even if the shelter was imperfect. It felt intentional. You feel that now. The earth responds to effort. Shovel meets soil. Soil moves. Wind, by contrast, cannot be reasoned with. Snow does not negotiate. Digging gives you something solid to push against, something that answers back. Not everyone agreed on how much to borrow from older practices. Some settlers distrusted anything that felt too unfamiliar. Others embraced techniques eagerly, especially after witnessing their effectiveness. Later interpretations differ on how openly this knowledge exchange happened, or how much was acknowledged afterward. What's clear is that the methods spread. You notice how your underground space resembles many others described across continents and centuries. Low ceilings, narrow entrances, minimal openings. These features appear again and again in cold climate shelters worldwide. They are not aesthetic choices. They are thermal ones. A small but telling habit mentioned in several frontier accounts involves orientation. Entrances were often angled away from prevailing winds. This reduced snow intrusion and heat loss. Settlers may not have had compass readings, but they watched how snow drifted, how wind bent grass, how storms moved across land. Observation replaced instrumentation. You adjust your own opening slightly, instinctively angling it. The difference is subtle, but noticeable. Air flows differently. Snow no longer creeps inward as aggressively. These tiny adjustments can mean the difference between discomfort and danger. What's fascinating is how quickly people learned once consequences were clear. The first winter punished mistakes harshly. The second winter taught lessons. By the third, survivors often displayed a quiet competence that surprised newcomers. Underground shelter became less of a last resort and more of a planned response. Still, there was no universal blueprint. Conditions varied too widely. What worked in dry prairie soil failed in wet river valleys. What worked in deep snow failed in shallow freezes. People adapted locally, guided by trial, error, and shared stories. Those stories mattered. Advice travelled slowly, but it travelled. A tip overheard at a trading post. A warning passed between neighbours. A structure glimpsed half buried on the horizon. Knowledge spread unevenly, but it spread. You think of how much of survival depends on humility. Accepting that someone else might know something you don't. Accepting that land has rules you must learn rather than fight. Underground shelter embodies that humility. It does not dominate the environment. It yields to it. Some settlers struggled with this psychologically. Living below ground felt like retreat, like failure. But winters had a way of reframing those ideas. Survival softened pride. Practicality replaced ideology. There's a recurring disagreement among later observers about whether underground living slowed progress or enabled it. Did it keep settlers safe long enough to build permanent communities? Or did it trap them in temporary solutions? The question lingers, unresolved, because both outcomes occurred. In some places, dugouts became stepping stones. In others, they became long-term homes. You settle more comfortably now, body aligned with the shape of the space. The earth feels familiar, not friendly, but known. That familiarity reduces stress in ways you didn't expect. Fear thrives on novelty. Repetition dulls it. You realize that underground shelter is not about hiding from winter. It's about cooperating with it, letting cold pass over you rather than through you, letting storms exhaust themselves while you conserve. That philosophy, once learned, changes how you see the land above too. You begin to notice slopes, soil types, windbreaks. You plan routes differently. You stop assuming that exposure is strength. As you breathe steadily, grounded and alert, you understand that survival knowledge is rarely invented in isolation. It accumulates, it travels, it adapts, and when conditions are harsh enough, it surfaces again. Carried by instinct and necessity. The earth has been teaching this lesson for a long time. You are only the latest student. Digging in winter is nothing like digging in stories. There is no clean rhythm to it. No satisfying progress. Every inch feels earned twice. The soil resists, stiff with frost, clinging to the shovel as if reluctant to let go. Your breath fogs the narrow space, then settles back onto your face as damp cold. Each movement sends a dull ache through muscles already tired from staying warm. And yet, the act itself keeps you alive. People who survived early frontier winters often describe digging as both punishment and promise. It drained energy fast. But it also produced results you could feel immediately. A deeper wall meant less wind. A higher lip of soil meant less drifting snow. Effort translated directly into safety, which was rare in a season where so much felt uncontrollable. You pause often, not from weakness alone, but from strategy. Move too fast. And sweat forms. Sweat freezes. That mistake ended more than one winter story abruptly. Survivors learned to work in short bursts, resting just long enough to cool without chilling. This slow, deliberate pace looks inefficient, but it is anything but. Your hands ache even through layers of cloth. Fingers stiffen, then loosen again as blood flow shifts. You rotate tasks when you can. Dig a little, pack a little, clear snow, adjust the opening. The work becomes circular rather than linear. Progress measured not in depth, but in balance. There's a small note in a frontier letter that mentions a man stopping mid-dig simply to listen. He waited to hear how the wind moved across the opening before continuing. It sounds almost poetic, but it was practical. Wind direction determined where snow would pile, which in turn determined where collapse was most likely. Digging blind was risky. Digging with attention improved odds. You listen now. The storm speaks in pressure and vibration rather than sound. Snow slides somewhere above. Heavy and slow. The ceiling holds. For now, digging also changes how you think. Your world narrows to shovel. Soil. Breath. Worries about the future fade. Memories quiet. Even fear takes a step back. This focus becomes a kind of mental shelter layered over the physical one. People didn't talk about it that way, but their descriptions circle the same idea. Work steadied the mind. As the space deepens, you begin shaping it rather than simply hollowing it out. Corners soften, edges slope, straight lines disappear. Underground rooms tend to be rounded, not by design, but by instinct. Curves resist collapse better than angles. Even without engineering knowledge, people learned this through observation and failure. Your knees sink into packed earth. The smell deepens. Rich and damp, it reminds you faintly of spring, which feels impossibly distant. You resist thinking too far ahead. Winter punishes impatience. A curious habit appears in multiple survival accounts, people naming their shelters. Nothing grand. Just simple names. The hole, the pit, the den. It may have been a way to claim ownership, or simply to make the space feel less temporary. Words have weight when everything else feels uncertain. You test the ceiling again, pressing upward gently. Firm. Compacted snow and soil have fused into a dense layer. This accidental reinforcement works in your favor, but it also adds risk. If collapse comes, it will be sudden. There will be no warning creak like wood offers. Just wait. This knowledge keeps you alert. You avoid digging directly upward now. Instead, widening sideways. Undercutting is dangerous. So is overconfidence. Survivors learn to read subtle signs. Fine cracks. Shifting texture. Changes in resistance. The ground communicates. If you pay attention, you stop to eat again. Not because hunger demands it, but because effort does. Calories convert to heat. Heat to movement. Movement to safety. This chain is fragile. Break one link, and everything slows. You ration carefully, chewing until jaw muscles ache, drawing every possible benefit from each bite. There's disagreement among later analysts about how long people could safely dig in such conditions without rest. Some accounts suggest hours. Others imply brief spurts over days. The truth likely varied with fitness, temperature, and urgency. What's consistent is that those who paced themselves lived longer. You feel fatigue creeping in again. But it's different now. Less foggy, more physical. Muscles complain clearly. That clarity is useful. You respond by slowing, not stopping. A rhythm emerges. Dig. Breathe. Pack. Pause. Repeat. Snow presses down harder now, adding weight to your roof. This seems dangerous, but it also seals gaps, reducing drafts. Underground survival is full of these contradictions. What threatens above often protects below. You smooth the floor with your boot, removing sharp edges. Comfort matters more than you expected. A body that can settle rests better. Better rest means better decisions. Pioneers learned to invest effort in small comforts, even when resources were scarce. Straw, hides, folded cloth, anything to separate skin from ground. Another overlooked detail surfaces in several accounts. People marked their shelters from above before storms fully set in. Poles, branches, bits of cloth, without markers. Emerging could be impossible. Snow erased entrances completely. More than one survivor was rescued by someone remembering where a shelter should be, not where it was visible. You think about that now, wondering if anyone knows where you are. The thought brings both comfort and unease. Underground living isolates by design. That isolation protects you from weather, but it also distances you from help. As digging winds down, you settle back into the space, breathing steady. The shelter is imperfect. It always will be. But it is deeper, more deliberate. Yours. The act of digging has changed you. It has burned away excess thought, excess fear. What remains is focus, attention, a quiet determination that does not announce itself loudly, but holds above you. The storm continues to reshape the land. Below, you have reshaped just enough of it to matter. That is the frontier bargain. You do not conquer winter. You carve out a pause and hope it lasts long enough. You rest now. Hands sore, body tired, mind strangely calm. The ground holds. The air moves. Time passes. And for tonight, that is enough. The air is the first thing you notice once the digging stops. Not its temperature, but its behavior. It moves differently now. Slower, heavier, as if reluctant to travel through such a small space. You inhale carefully, then exhale, watching how your breath lingers before dissolving into the dimness. Underground shelter solves one problem by creating another. Warmth stays longer. Air does not. This is where many early shelters quietly failed. People did not suffocate dramatically, as stories sometimes suggest. It happened gradually. A headache that would not lift. A strange sleepiness that felt pleasant at first. Breathing that seemed fine until it wasn't. Survivors later described the danger as subtle enough to ignore, especially when exhaustion encouraged rest. You resist that temptation now. You reach up and adjust the opening again, clearing packed snow, widening it just enough to feel a faint exchange. Cold air slides in. Stale air slides out. The balance is delicate. Too much opening, and heat drains away. Too little, and the space turns against you. Settlers learned this balance through trial, error, and observation rather than theory. Some noticed that lamps burned dimmer when air thinned. Others paid attention to how animals behaved. Dogs grew restless. Chickens refused to settle. These signs mattered more than invisible chemistry. You listen closely. The underground world amplifies internal sounds. Your breath, your pulse, the faint scrape of snow settling above. Everything feels close. That closeness sharpens awareness in ways you didn't expect. There's a small detail mentioned in a handful of winter accounts that feels almost absurd until you imagine it. People would occasionally hold a feather or scrap of thread near their ventilation opening to watch it move. Not for curiosity, but for survival. Motion meant air. Stillness meant danger. It was a simple test, but a reliable one. You improvise your own version now. Feeling with the back of your hand, a faint current brushes your skin. Enough? For the moment. Ventilation also changes how sound travels. With the opening adjusted correctly, outside noise returns faintly. Wind hums instead of roars. Snow slides instead of crashes. This auditory connection to the surface world reassures you. Total silence feels wrong. It suggests disconnection rather than safety. Some pioneers deliberately left small gaps open, even when it meant enduring colder temperatures. They preferred discomfort to uncertainty. Others sealed themselves tightly, believing warmth was worth the risk. Outcomes varied. Later retellings often simplify these choices. But in reality, there was no clear rule. Conditions changed hourly. Decisions had to be revisited constantly. You notice moisture collecting along the walls now. Condensation forms where breath meets cold soil. Droplets glisten faintly. This dampness creeps into fabric, into hair, into skin. Damp cold feels heavier than dry cold. It settles rather than bites. Managing moisture becomes another task layered onto survival. You shift bedding slightly, lifting it away from the wall. You brush condensation aside where you can. Small actions, but they matter over time. Wet clothing steals heat faster than wind ever could. There's a recurring observation in underground survival stories that often gets overlooked. People became incredibly attentive to their own bodies. Minor changes mattered. A headache, a change in breathing rhythm, a sudden chill in one limb. These signals guided decisions long before danger became obvious. You check in with yourself now. Breath steady, head clear, limbs responsive. You catalogue these facts calmly, the way someone else might check weather or supplies. Awareness becomes routine. The underground space feels smaller again as hours pass. Not because it has changed, but because your mind has adjusted. What once felt cramped now feels defined. Boundaries become familiar. Familiarity reduces stress. Still, the air demands respect. You resist sleeping deeply. Instead, you rest in short stretches, waking frequently to clear the opening and check airflow. This fractured rest mirrors what many settlers described. True sleep was rare during storms. Survival required vigilance even while exhausted. A lesser-known habit appears in several accounts. People would speak aloud periodically, simply to hear their own voice. Not prayer, not conversation, just sound. Speech confirmed alertness. Silence risked drifting too far inward. You find yourself doing the same, whispering a few words, then stopping to listen. Outside, the storm continues its slow rearrangement of the world. Snow piles higher, drifts harden, paths disappear. Underground, your connection to these changes comes only through subtle cues. Pressure, sound, temperature. You learn to interpret them carefully. There's disagreement among later commentators about how much air exchange underground shelters truly achieved during major storms. Some argue that snow itself allowed enough diffusion to prevent danger. Others believe many shelters were far riskier than survivors realized. The evidence is uneven, drawn mostly from those who lived to tell their stories. You adjust the opening again, erring on the side of caution. A bit colder now, but clearer. Your breath no longer feels heavy. That trade feels worth it. Ventilation also brings smell. Fresh, cold air carries the faint scent of snow and sky. It cuts through the earthy dampness, refreshing the space. Smell anchors you, reminding you that the surface world still exists beyond the packed soil. You shift your body slightly, redistributing weight, careful not to block airflow with your own movement. Underground survival turns even rest into a technical skill. Where you place your head matters. How you curl your legs matters. Everything interacts. At some point, you notice that fear has receded into the background. Not gone, just quieter. In its place is a steady attentiveness. This mental state appears often in survivor recollections. Once immediate panic fades, a kind of focused calm takes over. Decisions improve. Energy stabilizes. You realize that ventilation is more than a practical concern. It is psychological. Knowing air moves in and out reassures you that you are not trapped, that the shelter breathes, just as you do. As time passes, you fall into a rhythm. Check opening, clear snow, breathe deeply, rest briefly, repeat. The repetition itself becomes soothing, almost meditative. It creates structure where the storm has erased it. Underground shelter is never passive. It requires participation, attention, adjustment, but that engagement keeps you present, alive. You lean back again, eyes half closed, listening to the faint exchange of air above. Cold brushes your skin gently. Not enough to alarm, enough to remind you to stay aware. The storm will decide when it ends. You cannot hurry it. All you can do is maintain the fragile balance between warmth and breath, between rest and alertness. For now, the balance holds. Once the shelter settles into its rhythm, you become aware of how sound behaves differently underground. It no longer rushes toward you. It arrives softened, filtered, stripped of sharp edges. The storm above still exists, but it feels farther away than it should, as if someone has closed a heavy door between you and the world. Snow absorbs noise in a way few other things can. Wind loses its howl. Falling drifts land with a muted thump instead of a crash. Even your own movement sounds smaller here. This quiet is not silence. It is insulation for the ears as much as for the body. People who survived frontier winters often mentioned this shift without fully understanding it. They wrote about storms that sounded terrifying above ground and almost gentle below it. The same weather, the same danger, perceived completely differently depending on where you stood. That change in sound mattered more than comfort. It changed how fear behaved. Fear feeds on noise. Take away the roar, and it loses some of its urgency. You notice how your heartbeat seems louder now, no longer drowned out by wind. At first, this feels unsettling. Then it becomes reassuring. A steady rhythm, proof of continuity. You listen to it without anxiety, letting it guide your breathing. Underground. You begin to recognize patterns. The way snow slides in slow waves rather than bursts. The faint vibration when a heavier drift settles nearby. The subtle pressure change when wind shifts direction. These cues replace sight. You read the storm through touch and sound instead of vision. A number of winter accounts describe settlers being startled when they finally emerged, shocked by how violent the storm still looked. Underground. It had sounded almost calm. This mismatch could be dangerous. People misjudged conditions and surfaced too early, only to be forced back inside or worse. You remind yourself of that now. Quiet does not mean safe. It only means distant. The shelter itself adds to this illusion. Packed earth dampens vibration. Curved walls scatter sound rather than reflecting it. The space feels smaller acoustically than it actually is. Even a cough sounds contained, swallowed quickly by soil. Some settlers leaned into this quiet. They treated it as a signal to rest, to conserve energy. Others grew uneasy, craving noise as reassurance that the world still existed. Both reactions appear in early writings, sometimes from the same person on different nights. Emotional responses shifted with fatigue. You notice your thoughts slowing again, not from cold this time, but from the absence of stimulation. The mind, deprived of external input, turns inward. Memories surface uninvited. Old conversations, familiar rooms, summer sounds. You let them pass without attachment. Getting lost in memory makes the present harder to manage. To anchor yourself, you focus on listening intentionally, not drifting, but paying attention. Snowfall rhythm, air movement through the opening, the faint scrape of ice shifting. This active listening keeps you alert without burning energy. There's a small observation tucked into a pioneer journal that feels oddly modern. The writer notes that underground, storms felt less personal. Above ground, wind seemed to target you specifically, battering walls and skin. Below ground, the storm felt abstract, like something happening elsewhere. That distance made endurance possible. You feel that now. The storm is still dangerous, but it no longer feels like an opponent pressing its face against yours. It becomes background rather than confrontation. The quiet also reveals new sounds. Your stomach growling softly, fabric brushing against soil, the subtle creak of frozen ground adjusting under pressure. These noises might have been alarming at first. Now, they become familiar markers, signs that things are still functioning. You whisper again, just a few words. Then stop. Your voice sounds closer than before, bouncing gently back to you. Sound reassures. It defines space. Silence alone can feel endless. Some settlers filled this quiet deliberately. Humming, counting, soft singing, not for entertainment, but for orientation. Sound created a sense of direction in the dark. It reminded people of where they were in relation to themselves. You find a rhythm in your breathing that matches the quiet. Inhale, pause, exhale, pause. The pauses stretch slightly longer now. You are no longer rushing air in and out. Calm replaces urgency. Underground quiet also affects how pain registers. Without distraction, aches feel clearer but less sharp. You notice soreness in shoulders and wrists from digging. You adjust posture to relieve pressure. Small corrections prevent larger problems later. There's a lingering debate among later analysts about whether underground quiet improved survival by reducing stress or whether it encouraged dangerous overconfidence. The evidence suggests both occurred. For some, calm allowed better decisions. For others, it led to complacency. The difference often came down to awareness. You stay aware. You check the opening again. Brushing snow aside gently. Sound shifts immediately. Wind hum grows slightly louder. That confirms connection. You leave it open just enough. As hours pass, you begin to associate specific sounds with specific conditions. A low rumble means wind shifting. A soft settling noise means snow compressing. A sharper scrape suggests drifting near the entrance. This growing literacy in sound replaces the need to see. It's strange how quickly the body adapts when it must. Above ground, you relied on sight first. Underground, hearing takes the lead. Touch follows close behind. Smell, too, becomes more noticeable. The damp earth mixing with cold air in a way that signals freshness or stagnation. You realize that underground survival rewires perception. It changes which senses matter most. Those changes happen quietly, without instruction. The storm continues its work, but it feels less overwhelming now, filtered through layers of soil and snow. That filtering doesn't weaken the storm. It weakens its impact on you. As you settle back again, the quiet wraps around you like another layer of insulation. Not warm, but steady. It invites rest without demanding it. You remain alert, listening, breathing, letting time stretch without resistance. Underground, the world narrows, and in that narrowing, survival becomes manageable. The storm will still be there when you surface, but for now, it has lost its voice. The longer you stay underground, the more space begins to feel like an idea rather than a measurement. What once seemed impossibly small now feels workable, not comfortable, but sufficient. Your body learns where it can move and where it cannot. Your mind stops asking for more room and starts negotiating with what exists. This adjustment happens quietly, without ceremony. Families who survived winters this way often described a similar shift. At first, the confinement felt unbearable. Too close, too dark, too still. But after days or weeks, that reaction softened. People learned to fold themselves into the space rather than push against it. Life shrank. But it did not disappear. You curl slightly, then uncurl again. Careful not to knock the walls. Movement is deliberate now. Every action has a cost. Even reaching for food requires thought. Will the effort burn more warmth than the calories provide? Will shifting your weight collapse loose soil? These calculations happen automatically once space becomes limited. Underground living compresses more than bodies. It compresses relationships. When families shared these shelters, personal boundaries dissolved quickly. There was no privacy in the modern sense. Breath mingled. Body heat overlapped. Sounds could not be escaped. This closeness strained tempers and tested patience, especially during long storms when movement outside was impossible. Surviving accounts often mention arguments breaking out over trivial things. Who blocked the air opening? Who moved too much in their sleep? Who used the last piece of dry cloth? These conflicts weren't signs of weakness. They were signs of stress in a confined environment. You are alone here, but the pressure still exists. The absence of others brings its own challenges. Silence grows heavier. Decisions rest entirely on you. There is no one to share watchfulness, no one to catch mistakes. Isolation sharpens responsibility. You imagine what it would be like with others nearby. Children forced into stillness long before they were ready. Adults learning to move around them carefully. Older family members conserving strength. Becoming quiet observers rather than participants. These dynamics shaped underground life as much as soil and snow. Some families assigned roles to maintain order. One person watched the air opening. Another rationed food. Someone else monitored time. Such as it was. These roles provided structure when the outside world offered none. Even arbitrary systems helped. Routine stabilized nerves. You create your own routine now. Check air. Shift position. Eat. Listen. Rest. Repeat. The cycle gives shape to the hours. Without it, time would dissolve entirely. There's a lesser-known detail that appears in a few personal letters from frontier women. They describe deliberately reducing movement not just to conserve warmth, but to reduce friction between people. Stillness became courtesy. Quiet became cooperation. Underground. Social survival mattered as much as physical survival. You sense that truth even alone. Excess movement feels disruptive, not just tiring. The shelter responds to motion. Walls shed fine soil. Air shifts. Noise increases. Calm requires restraint. Children, according to several recollections, adapted fastest to underground living. They accepted limits without arguing against them. They slept when told, stayed still when needed, and treated the confined space as a game or a fort. Adults struggled more, clinging to habits that no longer applied. That contrast reveals something uncomfortable. Experience does not always equal adaptability. Flexibility matters more than knowledge when conditions change radically. You shift again. Careful. Slow. Your muscles have learned the boundaries. This familiarity reduces stress. What once felt claustrophobic now feels contained. The shelter has edges you understand. That understanding breeds calm. Food takes on new meaning underground. Meals are not social events or moments of pleasure. They are intervals of function. Fuel breaks. Chewing becomes work. Swallowing becomes strategy. Even taste fades into the background. Some families avoided eating together underground to reduce movement and noise. Others insisted on shared meals to maintain morale. Outcomes varied. What mattered most was consistency. Uncertainty exhausted people faster than hunger. You think about the passage of time again. Days lose their names underground. Morning and night blur together. Instead of clocks, people measured time by needs. Air checks, meals, rest periods. The body became the calendar. This temporal compression affected memory. Survivors often struggled to recall the order of events after emerging. Storms blended together. Days vanished. The mind recorded sensation more than sequence. You feel that happening already. The hours behind you feel indistinct. Not gone. Just merged. That's not a failure. It's adaptation. Underground space also alters posture. You sit differently. Sleep curled instead of stretched. Muscles shorten. Joints stiffen. Survivors learn to stretch deliberately whenever possible, even in limited space, to prevent stiffness from becoming injury. You extend your legs slightly, then draw them back. Slow. Controlled. Movement as maintenance rather than expression. There's disagreement among later observers about whether prolonged underground living weakened people physically or preserved strength by reducing exposure. Both seem true. Muscles atrophied from stillness. But energy was conserved. Survival required choosing which losses were acceptable. Psychologically, confinement reshaped priorities. Grand plans faded. Long-term goals shrank. People focused on the next hour rather than the next year. This narrowing was not despair. It was efficiency. You notice your thoughts doing the same. You are not thinking about spring. You are thinking about breath, warmth, stability. That focus feels right. As the shelter holds and the storm continues above, you realize that underground survival is not about endurance in the heroic sense. It is about adjustment, yielding space, yielding expectation, yielding control where it cannot be held. The earth presses in gently from all sides, limiting you, but also defining you. Within those limits, you find a way to exist. That existence is smaller than before, quieter, slower, but it is real. And in winter, real is enough. Fire. Underground. Becomes an idea more than a thing. You feel its absence immediately, like missing a sense you once relied on without thinking. Above ground, fire meant life, light, heat, reassurance. Below ground, it becomes complicated, dangerous, something to approach sideways, if at all. Early settlers learned this quickly, often the hard way. Flames consume oxygen. Smoke has nowhere to go. A hearth that felt harmless in a cabin could turn lethal in a confined space. Underground, fire could warm you or quietly end you without much warning in between. You sit still now, imagining the comfort of flame without daring to create it. Instead, you rely on subtler forms of warmth, layers of cloth, body positioning, the residual heat trapped in soil. These methods feel primitive at first, but they work precisely because they don't demand air or attention. People adapted by redefining what heat meant. It no longer came from brightness or crackling sound. It came from retention, conservation, preventing loss rather than generating gain. This shift in thinking marks a turning point in winter survival. Some pioneers experimented cautiously. A single ember sealed inside a clay vessel, a heated stone wrapped in fabric, a lamp shielded deep within a niche. Each solution carried risk. Too much smoke, too little air, a cracked stone releasing sudden steam. Success stories travelled. Failures often didn't. You feel the cold most acutely where heat escapes fastest. Hands, feet, face. You tuck your hands inward, pressing them against your core. Feet slide beneath layers. Breath warms the fabric around your mouth. These gestures feel instinctive, repeated without thought, refined through necessity. There's an understated observation in several winter letters that mentions people feeling warmer underground without fire than above ground with it. That sounds impossible until you consider wind. Flame fights cold constantly. Earth simply blocks it. You remember how fires demand tending. Wood must be gathered, ash cleared, sparks watched. Underground, attention is finite. Every task must justify itself. Fire rarely does. This doesn't mean fire disappears entirely from underground life. It changes form. Warmth becomes portable, temporary, carefully rationed. A stone warmed briefly and then buried in bedding. A pot heated once and then insulated heavily. Heat, like food, is stretched rather than consumed freely. Some settlers developed routines around this. Heat briefly during the safest moment, then retreat into darkness and stillness. The pattern mirrors animal behavior more than human tradition. Bursts of activity followed by long rest. You feel that rhythm now. Movement followed by stillness. Effort followed by quiet. Underground survival favors pulses rather than continuity. Light behaves differently too, if you have any at all. It is dim and precious. Candles burn oxygen. Lamps smoke. Many people chose darkness instead. Eyes adapted. Time slowed. Vision became secondary. Darkness underground is not total. It has texture. Shadows feel closer. Depth perception fades. You rely more on touch, memory, and sound. Objects are placed deliberately and rarely moved. Order prevents accidents. This reduced light altered sleep patterns. People slept in fragments. Short rests. Long wakeful periods. True night and day lost meaning. The body followed temperature and fatigue instead of the sun. There's debate among later commentators about whether underground living worsened winter depression or protected against it. Some accounts describe crushing monotony. Others describe a strange peace. The difference seems tied to expectation. Those who resisted confinement suffered more. Those who accepted it adapted. You accept it now. Not happily, not eagerly, but without argument. The earth has set the terms. You are negotiating within them. Without fire, smells become more noticeable. Damp, soil, cold fabric, your own breath. These scents are neutral. Grounding, smoke, for all its comfort, would complicate that balance. Clarity matters. You think briefly of cabins glowing against snow, smoke rising bravely into the storm. Those images are powerful, but they belong to moments when conditions allow choice. Underground. Choice narrows. Heat here is subtle. It accumulates slowly. Held close. Protected from loss. It feels less like warmth and more like absence of pain. That becomes the new goal. You shift your shoulders, feeling fabric warm slightly where it presses against skin. That small gain feels significant. Underground survival teaches you to value incremental progress. Fire once symbolized control. Now, restraint does. As you rest, conserving what little warmth you have, you realize that underground life strips survival down to fundamentals. Air, heat, awareness. Remove anyone, and the system fails. The earth provides one of those automatically. Air requires attention. Heat demands discipline. You breathe slowly, deliberately, keeping everything balanced. The storm continues above, unseen and unheard now. Fire is no longer the center of your world. Containment is. Light becomes optional long before morale does. You notice this gradually, not all at once. At first, you reach for brightness instinctively, wanting to see, wanting proof of space and safety. But underground, light costs too much. It eats air. It demands fuel. It creates movement where stillness is safer. So you let it go. Darkness settles in, not as an enemy, but as a condition. Your eyes adjust. Shapes soften. Edges blur. You learn the shelter by touch instead of sight. Where the wall curves inward. Where the floor dips slightly. Where fabric is stored. Familiarity replaces illumination. Once you know the space, seeing it matters less. Many settlers recorded this transition without fully explaining it. They wrote about getting used to the dark as if it were a skill rather than a surrender. In truth, it was both. Darkness simplified the world. Without visual distraction, attention narrowed to essentials. Time stretches differently without light. Minutes lose definition. Hours dissolve. Instead of counting, you feel time pass through hunger. Stiffness. The need to shift position. The body becomes the clock. This wasn't unique to underground living, but the effect intensified without sunrise or sunset to anchor perception. You notice your thoughts slowing again. Not dulling, just lengthening. Sentences in your mind stretch out, trailing off instead of snapping shut. This slower cognition feels strange at first, then comforting. It matches the pace of the shelter. Some people resisted this change. They clung to light, burning lamps longer than was safe, insisting on visibility as proof of normal life. Others embraced darkness quickly, seeing it as rest for the eyes and mind. Accounts differ, but the outcome often followed the same pattern. Those who adapted earlier conserved more energy. You sit quietly, hands folded, listening to your own breathing in the dark. The sound feels larger now, filling the space. You don't try to suppress it. Breath is life. Hearing it reassures you. Without light, memory sharpens. Sounds from long ago surface unexpectedly. Footsteps on wood. Wind in leaves. Voices calling across distance. The mind fills absence with recollection. This can comfort or unsettle, depending on where it drifts. Survivors often mentioned this mental wandering. Some found it soothing, a way to pass time. Others found it dangerous, pulling attention away from the present. Balance mattered. Let memory visit, but don't follow it too far. You ground yourself by touching the earth beside you. Cold, solid, real. The sensation brings you back. Underground survival depends on staying here, not elsewhere. Darkness also alters sleep. Without visual cues, the body slips into rest whenever it can. Short naps replace long sleep. You drift off briefly, then wake again, unsure how much time has passed. This fragmented rest mirrors patterns seen in many winter accounts. There's an understated detail in several journals describing how people stopped dreaming underground, or at least stopped remembering dreams. Sleep became shallow. Functional. Dreams require safety and surplus. Underground winter offers neither. Still, rest matters. Even brief moments of reduced awareness allow muscles to recover slightly. You let yourself sink into that half state, alert enough to breathe consciously, relaxed enough to release tension. Morale behaves differently in darkness too. Without sight, emotions feel less sharp. Fear softens. So does hope. Everything evens out. This emotional flattening protects against panic. But it can also dull motivation. Survivors learn to maintain small routines to keep morale from slipping too far. You whisper a few words again, not to break silence, but to confirm presence. Sound defines you against the dark. The shelter absorbs your voice gently, returning it softened. Children, according to multiple recollections, often handled darkness better than adults. They treated it as normal, even comforting. Adults carried expectations of light that made its absence feel like loss. Adaptation, again, mattered more than experience. You notice how darkness reduces comparison. You are not looking at what you don't have. You are not measuring space or imagining alternatives. You exist within what is available. That acceptance eases strain. There remains a question among later interpreters about whether prolonged darkness affected mental health long term. Some survivors reported lingering unease. Others recalled the period with surprising calm. Memory reshapes experience over time, smoothing edges or sharpening them depending on outcome. For now, darkness works in your favor. It encourages stillness. It reduces temptation to move unnecessarily. It conserves resources. It aligns your internal pace with the environment. You breathe slowly, letting the dark wrap around you without resistance. It feels less like being trapped and more like being held. The storm continues above, unseen, unheard, underground. Light has faded, but awareness remains. And awareness, in winter, is enough to carry you forward. You notice the change in children before you notice it in yourself. They stop fidgeting sooner. They accept stillness as a rule rather than a punishment. Where adults tense against confinement, children fold into it, adjusting their bodies and expectations with surprising ease. Underground winter reshapes everyone, but it reshapes the young fastest. This isn't sentiment, it's observation. Frontier families often remarked that children adapted to underground shelter with fewer complaints and less visible fear. They slept when told. They stayed close. They learned quickly which movements were allowed and which weren't. In the dark, with limited space, imagination became quieter rather than louder. Survival simplified play. Adults, by contrast, struggled with habits that no longer fit. Restlessness lingered. The urge to check, to fix, to improve refused to disappear. Many journals describe parents forcing themselves into stillness so their children would follow. Leadership, underground, meant restraint more than action. You feel that same discipline taking shape in your own body. The impulse to adjust constantly fades. You settle where you are, accepting the posture rather than arguing with it. Muscles learn what positions are sustainable. Joints complain less when movement becomes purposeful. Children also changed how they listened. Underground. Sound mattered. They learned quickly to recognize footsteps above, shifting snow, the difference between wind and settling earth. Adults often ignored these subtleties at first. Children didn't. They absorbed patterns instinctively, storing them without analysis. There's a small, telling detail in several family accounts describing children waking parents during storms because the snow sounded wrong. Sometimes they were correct, sometimes not. But the fact that adults listened anyway speaks volumes. Underground survival elevated attentiveness wherever it appeared. You imagine a child pressed close beside you, breathing quietly, mirroring your stillness. That closeness wasn't optional. It was structural. Space forced intimacy. Body heat overlapped. Movement synchronized. Children learned to read adults' breathing. Adults learned to read children's tension. This proximity changed family dynamics. Authority softened. Instruction became quieter. Gestures replaced words. Underground. Shouting wasted air and energy. Calm communication mattered. You notice how much energy silence saves. Children also learned early that boredom was dangerous, not because it harmed directly, but because it encouraged unnecessary movement. Many families developed quiet rituals to occupy young minds. Counting breaths. Whispered stories. Simple finger games. These weren't entertainment so much as regulation. Surviving letters mention mothers telling the same short stories repeatedly, not to pass time, but to maintain stillness. Repetition soothed nerves. Familiar words anchored everyone in a shared mental space. Variety was less important than predictability. You feel the value of that now. Repetition stabilizes. The same checks. The same breathing rhythm. The same posture. Each cycle reduces uncertainty. Children also learned quickly what not to touch. Ventilation openings. Stored food. Damp walls. Underground. Mistakes had immediate consequences. Learning happened fast. There's disagreement among later writers about whether this accelerated maturity benefited children long-term or burdened them too early. Some argue it built resilience. Others suggest it introduced lasting anxiety. The evidence supports both interpretations, depending on outcome and memory. What's undeniable is that children became competent participants in survival far sooner underground than they would have above ground. Confinement compressed learning. You sense that compression happening to you as well. Skills that once felt abstract now feel immediate. Breath control, stillness, listening. These are no longer ideas. They are habits. Children also seem to experience less fear of darkness than adults expected. Without contrast, darkness became neutral. Adults carried memories of light that made darkness feel like loss. Children, lacking those comparisons, accepted the environment as it was. You stop wishing for light now. The dark has become background. Useful. It hides limitations. It reduces longing. Underground winter stripped childhood of some softness. But it also removed some distractions. Survival narrowed focus. Children learned what mattered quickly because little else competed for attention. There's a haunting note in one account describing a child asking why spring had not come this year. When only weeks had passed, time underground stretched perception. Young minds struggle to place events in sequence. Adults did too. To manage this, families sometimes marked time physically. Knots in string, scratches in wood, pebbles moved from one pocket to another. These systems were crude but grounding. They reassured children that progress existed even when it couldn't be seen. You mark time now through breath, through checks, through hunger. It's less precise, but it works. Children often slept more deeply than adults underground. Their bodies surrendered to rest when allowed. Adults hovered between wakefulness and exhaustion, guarding air, warmth, and silence. This imbalance shaped nights. Parents listening, children breathing. You listen now, even alone, to that imagined rhythm. Slow, steady, human. Underground winter teaches an uncomfortable truth. Survival is learned fastest when conditions are strict. Freedom slows learning. Constraint sharpens it. Children understood this without naming it. They adapted because they had no alternative frame. Adults had to unlearn first. You settle again, accepting the space fully now. The shelter no longer feels temporary. It feels like a system you understand. Above, the storm continues its slow work. Below, learning continues too, quietly, breath by breath. And somewhere in that stillness, resilience takes root not loudly, not dramatically, but in small adjustments that hold. Animals change the underground space before people realize it. not in obvious ways, but in warmth, in sound, in smell. You notice it as soon as another body shares the shelter. The air feels different, slightly warmer, slightly heavier. Life multiplies its signals when more than one creature breathes in the same place. Frontier families often brought animals underground, not out of sentiment, but calculation. Livestock represented food, labor, future survival. Losing them to cold meant losing spring itself. Keeping them alive meant bending rules that would have seemed unthinkable in other seasons. You imagine the shift that happens when an animal settles nearby, a cow lowering herself slowly. Careful and uncertain, a goat pressed against a wall, chickens gathered in a corner, feathers puffed, dogs curling instinctively near human bodies. The shelter fills with quiet movement and shared heat. Body heat adds up. One animal is noticeable. Several become significant. People understood this without numbers. They felt it. The space warmed just enough to matter. Breath from many lungs softened the edge of cold. There's a detail mentioned in several winter recollections that surprises modern readers. Families often slept closer to animals underground than they ever would have above ground. The usual boundaries dissolved. Survival rearranged priorities. Warmth outranked comfort. You feel that logic immediately. An animal's presence stabilizes temperature. It also stabilizes sound. The gentle shifting. The rhythmic breathing. The occasional soft movement reassures the mind. Silence feels less absolute. But this arrangement carried risk. Animals consume oxygen. They produce moisture. Waste accumulates. Underground. These factors multiply quickly. People learn to balance benefits against danger, adjusting ventilation constantly. Some families separated animals with low partitions of earth or wood. Others didn't bother. The space was too small. Decisions were shaped by urgency rather than ideal design. What mattered was staying alive through the night. You imagine the smell now. Earth, damp fur, breath. Not pleasant, but grounding. Smell confirms life. It tells you the shelter is occupied. Functioning. Breathing. Animals behave differently underground, too. They grew quieter. Less restless. Many seemed to sense the need for stillness. Dogs curled tightly, conserving heat. Chickens stopped fussing. Livestock moved only when necessary. Their instincts aligned with survival. There's an observation buried in a few accounts describing animals alerting people to changes outside. A dog lifting its head. A horse stamping nervously. These signals mattered. Animals notice shifts in pressure, sound, and vibration long before humans did. You listen for those cues now, even without animals present. A habit learned through proximity. Underground survival sharpened awareness across species. The warmth animals provided wasn't dramatic. It didn't create comfort. It reduced loss. That distinction mattered. People weren't seeking warmth. They were slowing, cooling. Moisture, however, became harder to manage. Breath from multiple bodies condensed on walls. Bedding dampened faster. Some families rotated sleeping positions to avoid cold spots. Others layered straw thickly and replaced it whenever possible. Maintenance never stopped. There's disagreement among later historians about how widespread underground animal sharing truly was. Some argue it was common during extreme storms. Others suggest it was limited to emergencies. The truth likely varied by region and necessity. Where animals meant survival, rules bent further. You consider the psychological effect too. Animals anchored people emotionally. In the dark, confined space. A living presence reduced isolation. Touching warm fur reminded people of continuity beyond the storm. Children, according to several recollections, found comfort in animals underground. They slept more easily beside familiar creatures. Fear softened. Adults noticed this and adjusted arrangements accordingly. You imagine a child's hand resting on a dog's flank, feeling steady, breathing in the dark. That rhythm calmed nerves better than words ever could. Still, underground animal sharing demanded vigilance. Air had to move. Waste had to be managed. Space had to be respected. Complacency invited disaster. Some settlers developed strict rules. No open flame when animals were present. Ventilation checked more often. Movement limited. Others relied on intuition and luck. Outcomes varied sharply. There's a haunting note in one account describing a family saved from freezing but later weakened by illness due to damp. Foul air. Survival often came in stages. Solving one problem exposed another. You feel the complexity of that now. Every advantage carries cost. Underground living is not about finding perfect solutions. It's about choosing which risks you can manage. Animals shift that equation. They offer warmth and warning at the expense of air and cleanliness. In many cases, the trade was worth it. Without them, spring would bring hunger instead of renewal. You adjust your position, imagining how you would arrange bodies if you had to, where heat overlaps, where air flows, where waste stays contained. Underground survival becomes a puzzle solved continuously. The storm above continues. Indifferent to these calculations. Snow piles. Wind scours. Underground. Life clusters together, sharing heat and risk. You realize that this shared survival blurs distinctions. Human and animal, shelter and body, individual and group, everything becomes part of the same system. As you rest again, breathing slow and steady, you understand why animals were welcomed underground despite the mess and danger. They made survival feel less solitary, less abstract. Winter presses down. Underground, life presses back not with force, but with presence. And sometimes, presence is enough to get through the night. Time begins to behave strangely once you stop seeing it. Underground, without light or sound to mark the hours. The clock you carried in your head loses its authority. Morning does not arrive. Night does not deepen. There is only a long, continuous stretch of being awake, then resting, then waking again without certainty about when or why. At first, this unsettles you. You try to remember how long you've been here. A day, two longer. The answer slips away as soon as you reach for it. Frontier survivors often mention this disorientation. Not with panic, but with mild surprise, as if they had stumbled into a different relationship with time altogether. Storms did not just block roads and bury fences. They rewrote the calendar. Above ground, winter already bends time. Tasks take longer. Movement slows. Days shorten. Underground, that distortion deepens. Hours stretch and compress unpredictably. 10 minutes of digging feels endless. 2 hours of stillness pass unnoticed. The mind stops counting and starts responding. You notice that your body has become the primary timekeeper now. Hunger signals a new interval. Stiffness marks another. The need to check air or clear snow becomes the closest thing to a schedule. Time is no longer abstract. It is physical. Many pioneers describe this shift indirectly. They stopped dating journal entries during storms. Or they wrote vague phrases like sometime later or after a long while. Precision lost relevance when survival narrowed focus to immediate needs. You feel that narrowing now. You are no longer thinking in terms of days survived. You are thinking in terms of the next check, the next breath, the next adjustment. This isn't despair. It's efficiency. There's a subtle comfort in this. Without a clock ticking loudly in your thoughts, pressure eases. You are not failing to meet deadlines. You are not waiting impatiently for rescue or spring. You are simply existing within conditions as they are. Children underground often adapted to this time shift more easily than adults. Without rigid expectations, they accepted the rhythm of rest and wakefulness naturally. Adults, carrying habits shaped by sun and schedule, struggled longer. Eventually, most let go. You let go too. Sleep comes in fragments now. You drift for a while, then surface again. Alert but not alarmed. These shallow rests don't feel refreshing in the usual sense, but they take the edge off fatigue. Survivors often described underground sleep as functional rather than restorative. It maintained, rather than renewed. Dreams, if they come at all, are brief and disjointed. Images flicker and fade. The mind does not sink deeply enough to wander far. In a way, this keeps you safer. Deep sleep dulls awareness. Light sleep preserves it. You stretch carefully, feeling stiffness mark another passage of time. Muscles complain in predictable patterns. You respond automatically now. Shifting position, easing tension. This maintenance replaces any sense of routine you once had. There's an observation that appears across multiple winter narratives. People underground became less future-oriented. Planning narrowed. Thoughts about spring, planting, rebuilding faded. That future still mattered. But it stopped dominating attention. Survival demanded presence. You understand why. Thinking too far ahead creates longing. Longing wastes energy. Underground winter teaches restraint even in imagination. Some settlers tried to maintain calendars anyway. They counted days by marking walls or moving objects. For some, this helped. For others, it heightened anxiety. Watching days pass without visible change felt discouraging. Many abandoned the effort. You abandon it too. There is no advantage in knowing whether it's Tuesday or Saturday. The storm does not care. The ground does not respond differently. Time becomes circular instead of linear. Check air. Rest. Shift. Eat. Listen. Repeat. Each cycle resembles the last. Rather than dragging, it stabilizes. Repetition calms the nervous system. Predictability replaces progress. There's a lingering disagreement among later interpreters about whether this altered sense of time harmed people psychologically. Some accounts suggest confusion lingered long after storms ended. Others suggest the experience sharpened awareness and resilience. The truth seems personal. Time stretches differently depending on how you carry it. You notice something else now. Fear has changed shape. Early on, fear spiked sharply, tied to specific dangers. Collapse. Suffocation. Cold. As time loses definition, fear becomes less pointed. It diffuses, less intense, but more constant. Managing it requires steadiness rather than reaction. You steady yourself by listening. The storm's muffled presence, the faint movement of air, your own breathing. These sounds anchor you in the present moment, which feels safer than any imagined future. Eventually, you begin to sense change. Not a clear signal, but a shift in quality. The pressure above seems different. Snow settles rather than accumulates. The air feels slightly less sharp when you open the vent. These clues replace clocks. Frontier survivors often relied on these signs to decide when to emerge, not on how long they had waited, but on how the storm behaved. Time mattered less than condition. You remind yourself not to rush. Emerging too early resets everything. Digging out only to retreat again costs energy you may not recover. Patience becomes the final skill. You rest again. Eyes closed. Not sleeping deeply. Just letting awareness soften. In this state, time feels almost gentle. It no longer presses. It flows around you. Above, the storm is exhausting itself. Below, you are conserving. Underground winter does not just shelter the body. It reshapes perception. Time becomes a tool rather than a tyrant. You use it when needed. You ignore it when not. As you breathe slowly, grounded and alert, you realize that survival here is not measured in hours or days. It is measured in moments successfully managed. And for now, this moment holds. Hunger underground feels different than hunger above. It doesn't come with sharp edges or sudden urgency. It arrives slowly. Like a dimming light you barely notice until the room feels smaller than it should. Your stomach tightens, then relaxes again, settling into a steady, hollow patience. Food becomes less about pleasure and more about timing. You think about what lies beneath the frozen surface outside. Not fields or gardens now, but the quiet spaces people prepared months earlier. Root cellars dug deep enough to stay cool in summer and just warm enough in winter. Buried caches wrapped carefully against moisture. Food waiting below the frost line. Preserved not by technology, but by depth. People on the frontier learned early that winter survival began long before the first storm. Accounts from homesteads across the plains describe frantic digging in autumn. Not for shelter, but for storage. Vegetables packed in sand. Apples layered between straw. Grain sealed in barrels and sunk into earth. The work was dull, repetitive, and absolutely necessary. Underground. Those preparations become lifelines. You imagine the mental map settlers carried through winter, not of roads or fences, but of buried abundance. 3 steps past the oak stump, beneath the north wall of the barn, at the bottom of the slope, where snow drifts deepest. These locations mattered more than any surface landmark once storms erased the land. Accessing them, however, was never guaranteed. Snow-buried entrances. Drifts hardened into walls. Digging down required energy you might not have. Many families rationed based not on appetite, but on the hope that supplies would remain reachable. You weigh your own food now with that same restraint. A bite saved is a decision delayed. Eating too much too soon risks weakness later. Eating too little risks poor judgment now. Balance matters more than fullness. There's a quiet pattern that shows up in winter journals. Meals grew smaller, but more deliberate. People chewed longer, ate slower. Savoring wasn't indulgence. It was pacing. Slowing consumption extended warmth and time. You do the same. Each mouthful feels heavier than it should. Not in your stomach, but in your thoughts. Calories feel precious because they are. Underground storage had its own risks. Moisture crept in. Rodents found gaps. Containers cracked under freeze and thaw. People checked their caches obsessively during early winter, then less often as storms intensified. Eventually, checking became too dangerous. Some families brought small portions underground in advance, storing them near sleeping areas. Others relied on brief forays between storms. There was no universal method. Circumstance dictated strategy. You picture a settler listening for a lull, pulling on frozen boots, digging through waist-high drifts to reach a cellar entrance. Hands numb, breath burning. The trip costing nearly as much energy as the food provided. Those calculations haunted winter nights. There's a curious detail mentioned in a few accounts describing how taste changed underground. Sweetness dulled. Salt stood out. Fat became deeply satisfying. These shifts weren't imagined. Cold alters perception. So does scarcity. You notice it now. Whatever you eat feels functional rather than flavorful. Your body responds before your mind does. Warmth spreads slightly. Muscles ease. Hunger recedes just enough to think clearly. Root cellars weren't just storage. They were symbols of foresight. People spoke of them with pride. Not because they were clever, but because they worked. Even families who lost crops to frost sometimes survived winter because their cellars had been deep enough. Depth mattered. Too shallow, and freezing ruined everything. Too deep, and access became difficult. Finding the right balance took years of trial, error, and shared advice. Soil type changed everything. Sandy ground drained well but collapsed easily. Clay held shape but trapped moisture. You sense how much knowledge went into those quiet holes in the ground. Knowledge built without textbooks. Tested without mercy. There's disagreement among later observers about how evenly this knowledge spread. Some communities adapted quickly. Others struggled year after year. Geography played a role. So did cooperation. Neighbors shared techniques when trust existed. Isolation slowed learning. Underground winter intensified that isolation. Families relied on their own stores. Sharing became risky. Generosity could mean starvation. These choices weighed heavily. Survival blurred moral clarity. You feel the weight of that now, even alone. Every bite is a choice with consequences beyond the moment. Underground living magnifies responsibility. Food underground also shaped daily rhythm. Meals became anchors in the blur of time. Not celebrations, but checkpoints. After eating, you rested. Before eating, you worked or waited. The sequence mattered. Some families used food to manage morale, saving small treats for the worst nights. A spoon of honey, a dried apple slice. These moments mattered more than their calories suggested. They reminded people of seasons beyond winter. You search your own supplies for something similar, not to indulge, but to reassure. Even a familiar texture helps. Memory can warm in ways food cannot. There's a lingering question in many survival narratives: did people eat enough underground? Or did they simply endure hunger better than we expect, without records of body weight or calorie counts? The answer remains uncertain. What's clear is that winter thinned people, sometimes dramatically. You feel that thinning beginning, not in flesh, but in reserve. Energy no longer feels abundant. It feels managed. Still, food underground offers one crucial advantage. It doesn't freeze solid. Earth moderates temperature. Vegetables remain edible. Bread stays pliable. Liquids thicken but don't shatter containers. This stability mattered enormously. Snow above ground destroyed access. Underground preserved continuity. You rest again. Hunger eased slightly. Mind clearer. The shelter holds. The air moves. Food remains. For now, these facts line up just well enough to keep you steady. The storm outside will decide how long this balance lasts. Underground. Preparation decides whether balance exists at all. You close your eyes briefly, not to sleep deeply, but to let the moment settle. Beneath the frost, life waits patiently, not thriving, not growing, just enduring. And in winter, endurance is the most valuable harvest of all. Failure underground rarely announces itself loudly. There is no warning shout, no dramatic collapse most of the time. It begins with small changes that feel easy to ignore. A faint crack in the ceiling that wasn't there before. A dusting of soil on your sleeve. A sound that doesn't quite match the rhythm you've learned to trust. You notice those signs now, because you've learned to. People who survived frontier winters often described collapses as quiet events. Snow weight increased gradually. Soil compacted unevenly. Moisture weakened support in places no one could see. When failure came, it wasn't always catastrophic, but it was always urgent. You look up, feeling rather than seeing the ceiling. It presses back, solid for the moment. Still, you've learned not to assume stability lasts. Underground shelter works until it doesn't, and the line between the two is thin. There's a recurring note in winter recollections describing settlers brushing soil from their faces after waking, unsure whether it fell while they slept or had been there all along. Dust becomes a message. Pay attention. Something has shifted. You brush your sleeve now, just in case. Fine grains fall away. Nothing alarming, but you remember that collapse doesn't require total failure. A partial cave-in can block ventilation, seal an exit, trap moisture. Danger accumulates quietly. Snow above adds weight you cannot measure. Every hour, it compresses, turning light flakes into dense mass. What insulated you earlier now presses harder. Underground shelter thrives on balance. Too little snow, and drafts cut in. Too much, and pressure builds. Some settlers tried to relieve this pressure by digging vents upward, allowing snow to settle into empty shafts rather than onto the ceiling. Others avoided disturbing the roof at all, fearing they'd weaken it further. Outcomes varied. Later accounts disagree on which method worked best. You sense that uncertainty now. Intervening could help. It could also hasten failure. Choosing when to act becomes as important as how. You test the walls gently. Pressing outward, they hold. Rounded shapes resist collapse better than straight ones. That instinctive shaping from earlier digging now proves its worth. Earth distributes pressure unevenly, and curves redirect it. There's a small but telling detail in one account describing a family smoothing their dugout walls obsessively during storms, believing rough surfaces invited collapse. Whether that belief was accurate or not, The practice likely helped by eliminating stress points. Intent sometimes becomes effect. You listen again. The ground speaks in subtle ways. A low settling sound. A faint sigh as snow compresses. These aren't threats yet. They're reminders. Collapse risk also shaped where people slept underground. Many avoided resting directly beneath the thickest part of the roof. They shifted toward edges, sacrificing warmth for safety. That trade was calculated, not fearful. You adjust your position now, angling slightly away from the center. The cold deepens by a fraction, but the sense of pressure eases. You accept the exchange. There's disagreement among later writers about how common underground collapses truly were. Some suggest they were rare, exaggerated by dramatic retellings. Others argue they were underreported, as many incidents left no survivors to record them. The truth likely sits in the quiet middle, shaped by what people remembered and what they chose to share. What's clear is that collapse was feared precisely because it was unpredictable. Wood creaks before breaking. Earth often does not. You recall earlier lessons. Stillness matters. Excess movement loosens soil. Digging near the ceiling weakens support. Even shifting weight carelessly can destabilize fragile sections. Underground survival demands restraint. You rest again, but lightly. Awareness hums beneath fatigue. You're not tense, just attentive. Ventilation becomes more critical now. A partial collapse could seal the opening without you noticing immediately. You check it often, clearing snow gently, making sure air still moves. This routine steadies nerves and preserves safety. There's an odd comfort in repetition here. Action replaces worry. Checking becomes habit. Habit becomes reassurance. You imagine how terrifying collapse must have felt to those caught unaware. Sudden darkness deeper than before. Air thick with dust. Silence broken only by breathing that suddenly feels too loud. Many accounts stop abruptly around such moments, leaving outcomes unclear. You don't dwell on that. Dwelling wastes energy. You focus on what you can control. Some settlers reinforced their shelters mid-storm, packing additional soil against weak spots or adding improvised supports. Others avoided changes entirely, trusting existing structure. Both approaches appear in records, sometimes within the same family at different times. Experience shifted decisions. You consider reinforcing now. The thought passes. Conditions feel stable enough. Intervening might introduce new risks. You decide to wait, but remain ready. This balancing act defines underground winter life. Constant assessment. Minimal action. Rapid response if needed. You realize that collapse fear doesn't dominate your thoughts anymore. It has integrated into awareness, like cold or hunger. It informs behavior without overwhelming it. That integration marks adaptation. As hours pass, the ground settles further. Sounds soften again. Pressure equalizes. The shelter holds. You exhale slowly, letting tension release without losing alertness. This skill, relaxing without disengaging, has become second nature. The storm above continues. But underground, stability returns. Not guaranteed, not permanent, but present. You accept that underground shelter is always provisional. It buys time, not certainty. It trades exposure for vigilance. Those who understood that survived longer. You rest again, listening, breathing, letting the earth press in gently without fear. For now, the walls hold, the air moves, the night passes, and that is enough. Communication changes shape underground. Faces disappear. Gestures lose meaning in the dark. What remains are voices, muffled by soil and distance, stripped of expression and reduced to sound alone. You begin to understand why frontier neighbors learned to speak differently during winter. Volume softened, words shortened, meaning condensed. Above ground, people called out across space. Underground, they listened for replies. You imagine voices traveling through packed snow and frozen earth, bending around obstacles, losing clarity with every inch. Sound becomes precious. You wait for it. You strain to catch anything that isn't your own breathing. The absence of voices feels heavier than silence itself. Neighbors, when they existed nearby, were no longer visible presences. They became remembered locations. The family beyond the rise, the dugout near the creek, the shelter marked by a pole before the storm erased everything else. Connection relied on memory rather than sight. Some settlers developed simple signaling methods during winter, tapping on frozen ground, shouting at agreed intervals, hanging objects that rattled in the wind. These weren't sophisticated systems. They were hopeful ones, often unreliable, sometimes life-saving. You listen now, not expecting to hear anyone, but knowing that listening itself is a habit worth keeping. Underground winter rewarded those who stayed receptive. There's an understated pattern in frontier letters describing how people spoke less, but meant more. Underground. Every word used air. It carried weight. Conversations shortened to essentials. Questions were answered directly. Silence filled the gaps without apology. You find yourself speaking only when necessary now. Your voice feels loud in the small space. Even a whisper seems to travel farther than intended. You respect that. Quiet conserves more than warmth. When neighbors did communicate, it often happened indirectly. A shovel strike heard faintly through the ground. A muffled cough through a shared wall of snow. A sudden echo where none existed before. These signs reassured people that others were still alive. You imagine that relief, not seeing another person, but knowing they exist nearby. Underground winter turned community into an abstraction, presence without proximity. Some families dug connecting tunnels between shelters when conditions allowed. Others considered it too dangerous. Collapses, air issues, and misalignment made such projects risky. Where they worked, they created shared warmth and mutual support. Where they failed, they created tragedy. Records disagree on how common these connections were. You weigh the idea mentally. Digging outward would mean effort, exposure, uncertainty. Staying put means isolation. Both choices carry risk. Underground survival constantly demands such calculations. There's a curious detail in one account describing neighbors leaving notes sealed in jars near known shelter locations before storms. If conditions allowed later, someone might retrieve them. Messages were simple. We are here. We have food. We will wait. Even unread. The act of writing mattered. You think about that impulse now. Communication isn't just practical. It's psychological. Reaching outward affirms existence beyond the shelter. You whisper again, just to hear your own voice. It sounds steadier than before, less strained. You've learned how much sound the space can tolerate. Underground communication also shifted hierarchy. Loud voices lost authority. Calm ones carried farther. Children's whispers became as important as adults' instructions. Listening mattered more than commanding. There's disagreement among later observers about whether underground isolation strengthened or weakened community bonds. Some argue it forced families inward, reducing cooperation. Others suggest shared hardship deepened trust afterward. The evidence supports both. Depending on how winter ended, you sense that complexity. Isolation protects during storms. It separates afterward. Reconnection requires effort. As time passes, you become more sensitive to subtle vibrations. A distant thud could be snow settling or someone digging. You listen carefully, comparing it to known patterns. Most sounds resolve into natural causes. Some linger without explanation. You don't chase them. Speculation drains energy. You acknowledge uncertainty and return focus to what you can manage. There's an important shift that happens here. Underground winter teaches selective attention. You stop reacting to every stimulus. You learn which signals matter and which don't. This skill reduces anxiety and conserves strength. You check your ventilation again. Air moves. Sound changes slightly. The opening connects you to the surface world without exposing you to it. It's a thin line of contact, but enough. Some settlers described feeling closer to neighbors underground than they ever had above ground. Despite physical separation, shared storms, synchronized experience, everyone endured the same night, the same cold, the same waiting. That simultaneity created connection without interaction. You feel that now. Imagining others crouched in their own shelters, breathing slowly, listening, waiting. The thought steadies you. Communication underground isn't about exchanging information constantly. It's about knowing when to reach out and when to remain still. Both are forms of care. You remain still now. Ears open. Breath slow. If a sound comes, you will hear it. If it doesn't, you will endure. The storm above continues to erase distances. Underground. Connection exists quietly, invisibly, carried through soil and shared patience. And for tonight, knowing that is enough. Fear doesn't leave when the cold stabilizes. It changes shape. Early on, fear arrives sharp and immediate, tied to specific threats you can name. Collapse, suffocation, freezing, underground. Once those dangers feel managed, fear settles deeper, becoming something quieter and harder to locate. You notice it in the pauses between actions. It shows up when you finish checking the air and sit back, unsure what to do next. It creeps in when the shelter holds longer than expected. When nothing happens for hours at a time, the mind, deprived of emergencies, invents them. This is the strain that lingers after the worst seems over. Frontier survivors often described this stage without calling it fear. They spoke of restlessness, of unease, of a feeling that something was wrong even when conditions appeared stable. Underground winter stretched nerves thin, not through constant danger, but through prolonged uncertainty. You feel that tension now, hovering just beneath calm. The shelter has not failed. The air still moves. Your body remains responsive, yet anxiety hums softly, like a low vibration you can't quite shut off. This psychological weight outlasts the physical extremes. Cold numbs, hunger dulls, fear persists. People coped with this in small, deliberate ways. They created routines where none were required, checking the same wall repeatedly, adjusting bedding that didn't need adjustment, counting breaths. These actions weren't inefficient. They were grounding. You repeat your own rituals now, not because conditions demand it, but because your mind does. Routine gives fear somewhere to rest. There's an understated note in several winter journals describing people feeling most afraid when nothing demanded immediate action. During digging, hauling, or repairing, fear faded. Activity focused attention. Stillness let worry expand. Underground living forced stillness. That made managing fear a skill rather than a reflex. You manage it by narrowing focus again. Breath, body position, airflow, sound. You keep attention anchored in sensation rather than speculation. This keeps fear from spiraling outward. Some settlers turned inward emotionally. They withdrew, conserving not just physical energy, but emotional output. Others grew more talkative, filling silence to keep fear at bay. Neither approach was inherently better. What mattered was finding something that worked. You choose quiet, but not emptiness. You remain present. Children often sensed this shift in adults before it was acknowledged. They became quieter, more watchful. Their behavior mirrored emotional climate. Underground. Moods spread quickly. One person's anxiety could unsettle everyone. You imagine that dynamic now, even alone. Fear echoes louder in confined spaces. You respond by softening it rather than fighting it. Fighting costs energy. Softening reduces impact. There's a lingering question among later interpreters about how much psychological strain underground winters caused. Some argue trauma was widespread. Others suggest people normalized hardship more easily than modern readers expect. The truth lies somewhere between resilience and scar. You feel both possibilities in yourself. The experience sharpens you. It also wears on you. Both can be true. You listen to the shelter again. The familiar sounds reassure you. Snow settling, air moving, your own breathing. These signals ground you in what is happening rather than what might. Fear thrives on imagined futures. Underground survival demands presence. You remind yourself of what has already gone right. The shelter held through heavy snowfall. Ventilation remained open. Food remains. Your body adapted. These facts matter more than abstract worry. Some settlers kept mental lists like this, counting successes rather than dangers. It wasn't optimism. It was accounting. Survival required recognizing stability when it existed. You do the same now, quietly, methodically. Fear also interacts with exhaustion. As energy drops, anxiety can spike or flatten entirely. Underground. Both responses appeared. Some people grew hyper-alert, unable to rest. Others slipped into numbness. Neither extreme was ideal. You aim for the middle ground, alert enough to respond, relaxed enough to rest. This balance is fragile. You adjust it continuously. There's an odd comfort in knowing that fear itself is a sign of life. It means awareness persists. Indifference would be worse. Fear can be managed. Apathy cannot. You allow yourself to feel it briefly. Then let it pass. Acknowledge. Release. Return to sensation. As hours pass, fear loses intensity. It becomes background noise rather than foreground threat. This doesn't mean danger is gone. It means you've integrated uncertainty into your awareness. Frontier survivors often describe this moment as a turning point. Once fear settled into something manageable, endurance improved. Panic drained energy. Managed fear conserved it. You rest again. Not deeply, but with intention. Muscles loosen slightly. Breathing remains steady. You remain alert without strain. Above, the storm continues, but its grip is weakening. Underground, fear senses this before logic does. Anxiety softens when pressure eases, even subtly. You notice the shift without celebration. Underground survival teaches you not to trust sudden relief. You wait for confirmation through sound, air, and temperature. Still, the shelter feels calmer. The ground presses evenly. No new cracks, no new sounds. Fear recedes another step. You remain where you are, breathing slowly, allowing calm to spread without forcing it. The night is not over yet, but it no longer feels endless. Fear has not disappeared. It has learned to coexist. And that, in winter, is progress. The first hint that the storm is loosening its grip doesn't arrive with light or warmth. It comes as disbelief. You wake from a shallow rest and realize nothing urgent is demanding your attention. No new sounds. No shifting pressure. No creeping cold that requires immediate correction. The shelter feels stable. Too stable. Almost. You wait for the catch. Frontier survivors often describe this moment with suspicion rather than relief. After days of vigilance, calm feels untrustworthy. You've learned not to equate quiet with safety. Still, the absence of new threats registers somewhere deep, like a muscle relaxing without permission. You test the air opening again. Cold slides in, but not sharply. The air feels lighter, less aggressive. You inhale carefully, then exhale. Breath doesn't hang as heavily as before. That matters. You listen. Snow still settles, but the rhythm has changed. Instead of constant accumulation, you hear compression. The storm is no longer adding weight. It's rearranging what's already there. That distinction signals a shift. People who lived through repeated winters learn to recognize these subtle transitions. They didn't look for blue sky or silence. They listened for changes in texture. Wind losing its edge, snow sounds growing duller, the land signaling exhaustion. You feel that exhaustion now. Not in yourself, but in the storm. Still, you don't move quickly. Emerging too soon carries its own risks. Fresh drifts conceal hazards. Roofs may still be unstable. Paths remain erased. Many accounts describe settlers stepping out prematurely, only to retreat again when conditions proved harsher than expected. You sit with the uncertainty, letting it settle. Your body feels different now, less tense. Muscles still ache, but the ache feels familiar rather than alarming. Hunger is present but not sharp. Cold is noticeable but manageable. These internal signals align with the external ones. Everything points toward easing, but nothing confirms it completely. You remember stories of people waiting an extra day underground, even when storms seemed finished. Caution extended survival more reliably than optimism. Winter punished haste. You adjust your position slightly, preparing rather than acting. Boots within reach, tools close, clothing layered but not yet worn. Preparation without commitment. There's a faint sound now that you haven't heard in a while. Wind moving higher above, rather than directly overhead. This suggests open space returning to the surface. Drifts settling into final shapes. The storm releasing its hold. You place your hand against the earth again. The temperature feels marginally different. Not warmer exactly, but less draining. The ground has stopped stealing heat as aggressively. This change is subtle, but you trust it. The ground has been honest with you so far. Frontier journals often mention this stage as the most mentally taxing. Waiting after danger seems past requires discipline. Fear no longer sharpens focus. Fatigue tempts action. People wanted the ordeal to be over. Winter rarely obliged on demand. You stay where you are. Minutes pass. Maybe hours. Time remains indistinct. But patience feels easier now. You're no longer bracing against constant threat. You're observing. Finally, you decide to test the surface gently. Not to emerge, but to probe. You push upward near the opening, clearing snow slowly, listening carefully for shifts. The resistance feels different, lighter. Snow breaks apart instead of compressing further. Air rushes in more freely now. It smells different, cleaner. The sharp metallic edge has softened. This confirms what sound and pressure already suggested. The storm is ending, or at least pausing long enough to matter. You don't climb out yet. Instead, you widen the opening slightly, enough to let more air circulate without exposing yourself fully. This cautious step mirrors advice passed quietly among settlers. Let the world come back to you before you return to it. You sit back and wait again. As you wait, you notice how your thoughts begin to drift outward for the first time in days. You think about the surface, about snowdrifts sculpted into unfamiliar shapes, about buried fences and lost paths, about the work ahead. That work feels daunting, but not overwhelming. Underground winter has narrowed your focus so thoroughly that large tasks feel distant, manageable later. Right now, safety matters more than productivity. Eventually, you feel ready to move, not eager, just ready. You pull on outer layers slowly, checking fit and feel. Limbs respond well enough. Stiff, but functional. You flex fingers, toes. Everything answers. You clear more snow from the opening. Careful not to dislodge the roof. Light filters in faintly, diffused by snow. It's not bright, but it's different. Your eyes adjust slowly, blinking against the change. You pause again. Letting light in too quickly can disorient. Underground living has recalibrated your senses. You respect that. There's a moment here that many survivors described with conflicting emotions. Relief mixes with reluctance. The shelter kept you alive. Leaving it feels risky, even though you know you must. The earth feels safer than the open world for a moment longer. You acknowledge that feeling without judgment. Then, carefully, you prepare to emerge. You don't stand upright immediately. You rise slowly, testing balance. Snow presses back, then gives way. Cold air touches your face. Sharper than inside, but not hostile. You stop halfway, letting your body adjust. This incremental return reduces shock. Survivors learn to respect transition as much as survival itself. You listen one last time from within. The shelter is quiet, stable. It did its job. Soon, you will step fully back into the world reshaped by the storm. But not yet. For now, you remain between ground and sky, breathing, steady, letting the moment settle. The worst has passed. You know that not because everything is safe, but because everything is manageable again. And after a winter like this, manageable feels like a gift. When you finally step out, the world feels unfamiliar in a way that is hard to describe. It isn't just the snow, it's the scale. Everything looks flatter, quieter, and strangely simplified, as if the storm has erased unnecessary details and left only essentials behind. The land feels paused, caught between what it was and what it will become next. You stand still longer than you need to. Many people who survived long winters underground wrote about this hesitation. They described emerging slowly, not from weakness, but from caution. The surface had become unpredictable. Familiar landmarks were gone, paths erased, distances distorted by snow and glare. Rushing back into that world invited mistakes. You let your eyes adjust. Light feels harsh at first, bouncing off white surfaces in every direction. Your pupils struggle to find edges. You squint, turning your head slightly, using peripheral vision instead of staring directly. This adaptation happens instinctively. Underground living has taught you to respect sensory transition. The silence surprises you most. Storm noise has vanished, but sound has not returned yet. Snow absorbs everything. Even your own footsteps land softly. Almost apologetically, the world feels hushed. Not calm, but waiting. Frontier survivors often noted this quiet as unsettling. After days of constant wind and pressure, stillness felt unnatural. Some mistook it for danger. Others felt an unexpected peace. Both reactions appear again and again in winter accounts. You breathe deeply. The air is cold, but clean. It fills your lungs fully. Without resistance. This simple act feels luxurious after rationed breathing underground. Still, you take it slowly. Sudden exertion now could undo days of careful conservation. You look back at the opening behind you. The shelter blends into the landscape almost immediately. Without knowing where to look, it would be invisible. This invisibility protected you during the storm. Now it reminds you how easily people vanished in winter. You mark the spot carefully. A branch. A tool. Something upright that breaks the snow's smooth surface. This habit appears often in survivor recollections. Leaving shelters unmarked led to tragedy more than once. As you scan the horizon, you notice changes everywhere. Drifts where none existed. Depressions where snow collapsed inward. Fences buried to their rails. Trees bent into unfamiliar shapes. The storm has edited the land ruthlessly. You take your first steps cautiously. Balance feels different. Snow conceals uneven ground. What looks solid may collapse. You test each step before committing weight. This careful movement contrasts sharply with the freedom you remember from before winter. That freedom feels distant now. People who lived through these conditions often spoke of relearning how to walk afterward. Muscles stiffened. Joints protested. Balance shifted. Underground survival preserved life, but it demanded a period of reacclimation. You stretch gently, feeling stiffness release in small increments. You do not rush. You have learned the cost of haste. There's a curious note in one winter journal describing a man who laughed out loud upon emerging. Not from joy, but from disbelief. The world looked too large after days underground, too exposed. The sky felt heavy again. You feel that weight now. Without soil overhead, the openness feels almost threatening. Underground trained your body to expect boundaries. The absence of them requires adjustment. As you move farther from the shelter, you begin to recognize places by shape rather than detail. A slope, a tree line, the way snow has piled against a familiar structure. Orientation returns slowly, piece by piece. Frontier accounts often mention this disorientation lasting hours or even days. People misjudged distances, walked past familiar landmarks, got lost within sight of home. Snow flattened reference points mercilessly. You pause often, checking direction, listening for sound. Your senses, tuned to underground survival, need time to recalibrate to openness. Emotionally, something else happens now. Pride begins to surface, not loud or boastful, but quiet and heavy. You survived, not through strength alone, but through adaptation. That realization settles slowly. Some survivors avoided talking about these winters afterward. Others told the stories repeatedly. Both responses make sense. Endurance reshapes identity, whether it's shared or kept private. You feel no urge to celebrate yet. There will be time for that later, if at all. Right now, assessment matters more. You check nearby structures. Rooflines barely visible. Doors sealed. Smoke absent. You wonder who else made it through. Still underground or emerging cautiously like you. Community reconnects slowly after storms like this. People often called out, listening for replies. Not shouting, just gentle calls. Conserving energy and air. You do the same. Your voice sounding strange in the open air after days of muffled sound. No reply comes yet. That doesn't mean anything. Everyone moves at their own pace. You return your attention to practical tasks. Clearing entrances, checking animals, accessing stored food. Underground survival ends gradually, replaced by surface survival. Different rules, different risks. The storm may be over, but winter is not. Cold still lingers. Resources remain limited. The lessons you learn below ground don't vanish when you emerge. They inform everything that comes next. You glance once more at the shelter. Half hidden now. It feels oddly personal. A place that held you when nothing else could. You won't forget it. As you move forward into the reshaped landscape, you carry something intangible with you. A quieter confidence, a deeper patience, an understanding that survival often happens out of sight, beneath the surface, away from stories and witnesses. The land waits for you to adapt again, and you will. Not everyone dug down when winter tightened its grip. You begin to notice this once the land opens up again. Once stories surface alongside people. Some shelters lie empty. Some cabins show signs of desperate last efforts. Others appear untouched, as if their occupants never truly believed the storm would last this long. Choice, it turns out, mattered as much as preparation. Frontier winters exposed differences in belief as much as skill. Some settlers trusted cabins absolutely. Solid walls, a roof, a fire. These things had always meant safety before. Digging into the ground felt like surrender, like admitting weakness or failure. Pride, habit, and hope combined into a dangerous confidence. You recognize that mindset now, even if you didn't share it. Letters and recollections mention neighbors who refused to abandon surface shelters until it was too late. They patched cracks, fed fires endlessly, slept in shifts to keep flames alive. They believed endurance meant standing upright against winter, not yielding to it. Sometimes that worked. Often, it didn't. Others simply lacked the means to dig. Frozen ground resisted weak tools. Rocky soil made progress nearly impossible. Time ran out before shelters could be deepened. These weren't foolish choices. They were constrained ones. You think about how survival stories often flatten these distinctions. Winners are praised for wisdom. Losers are dismissed as careless. Reality was rarely so simple. Conditions differed. Resources varied. Decisions were made with incomplete information and limited options. There's a quiet disagreement among later observers about how much underground shelter was truly a choice rather than a last resort. Some argue it reflected foresight. Others suggest desperation drove most people below ground. Both perspectives contain truth. You walk past a cabin now, Roof bowed under snow. Walls intact, but cold inside. The fire pit is clean. Unused for days. Someone left in a hurry or not at all. The door stands open, filled with drifted snow. The scene doesn't accuse. It simply exists. Some families chose to move rather than dig. They followed rivers, sought lower ground, headed toward known settlements. Mobility worked in mild winters. In severe ones, it proved deadly. Snow erased paths. Wind erased direction. Distance became a trap. Underground shelter favored those willing to stay put. That stillness felt counterintuitive to people used to solving problems through movement. Digging required commitment to place. Once you went down, leaving became difficult. You remember how reluctant you felt to trust the ground at first, how unnatural it seemed to disappear beneath the surface. That hesitation appears often in early accounts. Going underground violated expectations about progress and civilization. It felt primitive in a world trying to move forward. Yet winter stripped those ideas away. Survival did not care about progress. It cared about physics. Some settlers rejected underground living because of fear rather than pride. Claustrophobia, darkness, the thought of collapse. These fears weren't irrational. Underground shelter carried real risks. Choosing it meant accepting those risks consciously. Others avoided digging because of superstition. The ground was associated with death, burial, the unknown. Hiding underground blurred uncomfortable boundaries. These beliefs mattered more in some communities than others, shaping decisions as much as climate. You realize now how much culture influences survival choices. Techniques don't exist in isolation. They're filtered through belief, memory, and identity. There's a small but telling note in one account describing a man who dug an underground shelter for his family but refused to sleep in it himself. He stayed above, tending the fire, convinced his role demanded it. He survived. Barely. His family credited the shelter. He credited duty. Both narratives persisted. Who was right? The question lingers without resolution. You think about how underground survival rarely looked heroic. It involved hiding, waiting, yielding ground. These actions clash with frontier myths built around endurance, conquest, and visible struggle. Stories favored those who stood tall in storms, not those who disappeared beneath them. That mismatch shaped memory. Underground living was underreported not because it was rare, but because it didn't fit the image people wanted to preserve. Survival that required humility didn't translate easily into legend. You feel that tension now, standing above ground again. It would be easier to frame your survival as toughness rather than adaptability. But you know the truth. The ground did most of the work. You listened. Some settlers learned this lesson only after loss. They dug cellars deeper the following year. They built half-buried homes. They prepared earlier. Winter educated brutally but effectively. Others never adjusted. They left, abandoned claims, returned east. Winter acted as a filter, shaping settlement patterns more powerfully than any policy. You look across the landscape and see evidence of those decisions. Some places repopulated quickly. Others remained empty scars. Underground shelter influenced not just individual survival, but the future of entire communities. There's disagreement among historians about whether widespread underground living slowed development or enabled it by keeping people alive long enough to rebuild. The answer depends on where you stand. Progress requires survivors. Survivors require compromise. You recognize now that underground shelter wasn't a step backward. It was a pause, a holding pattern that preserved possibility. Those who rejected it weren't always wrong. Sometimes conditions didn't demand it. Sometimes cabins held. Sometimes storms broke early. Survival doesn't reward consistency. It rewards fit. You feel grateful that you chose well enough, or were forced into a choice that worked. That gratitude doesn't erase uncertainty. It deepens respect for how narrow the margin was. As you continue moving through the aftermath, you carry these observations quietly, not as judgment, but as understanding. Winter exposed limits. Underground shelter revealed flexibility. You know now that survival isn't about choosing the strongest option. It's about choosing the option that aligns with reality as it exists, not as you wish it to be. And in winter, reality often lies just beneath your feet. What surprises you most, once movement returns and breath no longer feels rationed, is how quickly the lessons of winter begin to fade. Not immediately, not consciously, but subtly, the way cold loosens its grip without asking permission. As days stretch forward, the urgency that drove you underground softens, and with it, the habits that kept you alive begin to loosen too. Frontier winters did not just test survival, they tested memory. You notice it in yourself first. A thought like, "Next time I won't wait so long," or "That storm was worse than most." The mind reshapes experience to make it bearable, to make it feel exceptional rather than instructive. This is how hard-earned knowledge slips through fingers once warmth returns. Surviving accounts from the frontier hint at this forgetting. Dugouts filled in, cellars left shallow, emergency pits collapsed intentionally or neglected. People wanted the ground to release them, not remind them. Underground living felt temporary, even when it had been essential. You walk past an old shelter now, partially caved in, already blending back into the land. No marker, no memory attached, just a depression in the snow that will vanish by spring. Someone survived here once. Someone learned something, and then moved on. This pattern repeats across regions and decades. Underground shelter appears in times of crisis, then disappears during recovery. It is built quickly, abandoned eagerly. The earth is asked to help, then politely ignored once danger passes. Some settlers actively erased these shelters. They filled them in to prevent accidents. They dismantled reinforcements. They covered entrances to protect livestock. Practical reasons. Yes, but also symbolic ones. Filling the hole meant closing the chapter. You understand the urge. Living underground challenged identity. It contradicted ideas of progress and permanence. People wanted homes that stood above ground, visible and proud. Burrowing did not fit the narrative of settling a land. There's a recurring tension in post-winter accounts between gratitude and embarrassment. Writers thanked the shelter quietly, then spoke loudly about rebuilding cabins. Survival was acknowledged, but adaptation was downplayed. You feel that tension now. Part of you wants to move forward quickly, to focus on clearing paths, repairing roofs, restoring normalcy. Another part wants to remember every detail of what kept you alive. Memory, it turns out, is also a survival skill. Some communities tried to institutionalize these lessons. They dug deeper cellars, built earth-sheltered homes, planned for worst-case winters. These places fared better when storms returned. Others reverted to old habits, trusting that last winter had been an anomaly. Winter does not reward that assumption. There's disagreement among later observers about why these lessons faded so quickly. Some argue human optimism overrides caution. Others suggest economic pressure pushed people to prioritize visible progress over hidden preparedness. Both forces played a role. You notice how quickly conversations shift away from survival once people reconnect. Stories shorten, details blur, focus turns to spring planting. Repairs. Trade. The underground period becomes a brief reference rather than a guide. This fading isn't intentional. It's protective. Reliving confinement and fear exhausts the mind. Forgetting makes space for hope. Still, forgetting carries cost. You imagine another winter arriving unexpectedly. The ground frozen hard before shelters are prepared. Tools dull. Time short. Those who remember dig sooner. Those who don't hesitate. This cycle appears repeatedly in frontier history. Harsh winters followed by adaptation, followed by forgetting, followed by hardship again. Progress moved in, fits and starts, shaped as much by memory loss as by innovation. You pause, looking at the land with new eyes. You notice slopes where snow piled dangerously, low spots where cold settled. Soil types that held or collapsed. These observations didn't matter before. Now they do. You know that when next winter comes, you will see the ground differently. You won't wait for desperation to push you underground. You'll plan for it as an option, not a failure. Some settlers reached this conclusion too. They integrated underground space into daily life, rather than emergency response. Root cellars became storm shelters. Basements deepened. Half-buried homes normalized. These designs quietly carried winter wisdom forward. Others resisted. They rebuilt taller cabins, larger windows, thinner walls. Summer optimism shaped architecture as much as winter experience. The land rewarded some choices and punished others. You realize that forgetting is selective. People remember what fits their hopes. They forget what threatens comfort. Underground survival threatened more than physical ease. It threatened identity. But identity, like shelter, must sometimes bend. You mark the location of your shelter carefully, even as snow melts, not because you plan to live there again immediately, but because you refuse to erase it. Memory requires landmarks. You take a moment to touch the earth where it once held you. It feels ordinary now, cold, but manageable. You know better. The ground didn't change. Conditions did. As you move forward, rebuilding, reconnecting, restoring, you carry something invisible with you. Not fear, not pride, but awareness, a quiet knowledge of where safety truly lies when the surface world becomes hostile. History often remembers triumphs built above ground, but survival, more often than not, happens beneath notice. And if winter returns with the same ferocity, you already know where to go. Even now, long after the snow has softened and paths have reappeared, the ground continues to teach quietly, without insisting that you listen. You notice it when modern structures echo old shapes, when concrete walls sink deeper than necessary, when emergency shelters borrow the logic of Earth without saying so aloud. The lesson never vanished. It simply changed names. You begin to recognize how many solutions trace back to the same idea you trusted underground. Stability comes from mass, from insulation, from yielding rather than resisting. These principles didn't expire with the frontier. They adapted, the way all useful knowledge does. Storm cellars appear first in memory, dug deep beside farmhouses, lined carefully, entered during tornadoes or freezes. Their purpose feels different from your winter shelter. But the logic is identical. When the surface world turns hostile, the ground offers consistency. It doesn't matter whether the danger is wind, cold, or time. You think of basements now, so common they barely register. Below frost lines, protected from extremes, used for storage, shelter, sometimes living space. Their origins are practical, not aesthetic. They exist because someone, somewhere, learned the hard way that depth matters. Modern emergency bunkers carry this logic further, reinforced, sealed, equipped with air systems. Technology layers complexity onto a simple truth discovered generations ago. Earth moderates chaos. You smile slightly at that realization. The ground doesn't care how advanced you think you are. Its rules remain consistent. There's an argument that appears in later writing about whether these designs are truly inherited from frontier experience or independently rediscovered. Some suggest necessity always leads humans underground eventually. Others argue knowledge traveled, quietly passed along, disguised as innovation. The distinction matters less than the outcome. You see the outcome everywhere now. Even architecture that never goes underground borrows the idea indirectly. Thick walls, earth-toned insulation, passive temperature control. These designs mimic what soil does naturally. They aim to reduce exchange rather than increase it. You feel a small sense of satisfaction knowing that what saved you once still shapes the world, even if few remember why. Disaster planning manuals recommend staying low during extreme cold, sheltering in interior rooms, blocking drafts, conserving heat. These guidelines echo frontier wisdom without mentioning it. The language has changed. The principle has not. You recall how unnatural it felt at first to disappear below ground, how every instinct urged you to stay upright, visible, moving. Modern life reinforces those instincts. We equate safety with activity, progress, exposure. Underground winter taught the opposite. Sometimes, safety lies in retreat, in patience, in letting systems exhaust themselves while you conserve. You notice how modern conversations about resilience often circle this idea without naming it. Flexibility, adaptation, redundancy. These concepts thrive in underground shelter. You had backup air, backup warmth, backup time. Nothing relied on a single solution. You carry that thinking forward now, into everything. You plan with layers. You assume failure. You respect limits. Underground survival rewired your approach to risk. There's a quiet irony in how rarely this wisdom is acknowledged openly. We celebrate visible triumphs, not hidden endurance. We build monuments above ground, not markers for shelters that saved lives. Yet when disaster strikes, people instinctively seek basements, tunnels, subways, caves. The body remembers what culture forgets. You feel that memory in yourself now. It's not a fear response. It's recognition. Modern cities build shelters beneath parks. Hospitals bury critical systems underground. Data centers hide beneath layers of earth. The most important functions retreat below the surface when stakes rise. This is not regression. It's continuity. You think back to the first moment you pressed your hand into frozen soil. Uncertain and desperate. That moment contained the same logic as these modern structures. Earth as buffer, depth as protection, stillness as strategy. There's a subtle comfort in knowing that this knowledge persists, even if disguised. It means survival is cumulative. Lessons don't disappear entirely. They sink, settle, and wait to be needed again. You imagine future storms, different shapes, different names, climate shifts, infrastructure failures. The details will change. The response, at its core, will not. People will seek shelter. They will reduce exposure. They will go underground physically or metaphorically until danger passes. You feel less alone knowing this. Your experience wasn't isolated. It was part of a long pattern that stretches backward and forward. The ground beneath you feels solid as ever, unchanged by memory or forgetting. It will be there when needed again. As you walk away, you don't romanticize what happened. Underground winter wasn't noble or dramatic. It was quiet, unseen, effective. And that is exactly why its lessons endure. Leaving the earth is not a single action. It happens in stages. Some physical, some mental, many unnoticed until much later. Even as you move fully back into the open world, part of you remains calibrated to depth, to stillness, to listening before acting. You feel it in small decisions, where you choose to stand when the wind picks up again, how you store food, how you prepare for cold long before it arrives. Underground winter has shifted your instincts, quietly but permanently. Early pioneers often spoke of this change without fully naming it. They wrote about feeling uneasy in open spaces for a time, or preferring low ceilings and thick walls, even in summer. The body remembered what the mind might try to dismiss. Safety had a shape now, and it wasn't vertical. You notice how you scan the ground more carefully than before. You read slopes, soil color, snow patterns. The land feels more legible, as if winter taught you a new language you didn't know you were learning. Underground survival sharpened perception rather than dulling it. There's a small observation buried in several late-life recollections from settlers who lived through severe winters. They mention that after such seasons, nothing felt quite as frightening again. Not because danger vanished, but because they understood how much could be endured quietly, without witnesses or drama. You recognize that feeling now. It isn't bravado. It's proportion. The memory of Earth pressing close no longer feels claustrophobic. It feels grounding. When winds rise or storms threaten, You don't panic. You evaluate. You remember that safety doesn't always look like escape. Sometimes it looks like waiting in the right place. You also notice how gently you treat the land now. Digging no longer feels like conquest. It feels like collaboration. The earth gave you time when nothing else could. That creates a kind of respect that lingers. Some pioneers carried this respect forward visibly. They built homes that hugged the ground. They planted windbreaks. They designed with winter in mind rather than hoping to outrun it. Others buried the experience, eager to reclaim a sense of control. Both responses make sense. Underground winter strips away illusion. What grows back afterward depends on temperament. You think about how stories are told. How survival above ground is easier to narrate. Marches, fires, battles against the elements. Underground survival resists that framing. It is passive by appearance, active by discipline. It doesn't lend itself to heroic language. And yet, it worked. You don't feel the need to explain this to anyone. The knowledge sits comfortably inside you. It doesn't demand validation. It doesn't need to be retold loudly. It informs rather than announces. As seasons change, you notice how winter no longer feels like an enemy. It feels like a force with rules you understand better now. Harsh, yes. Unforgiving. Often, but predictable in its indifference. Underground living taught you how to align with that indifference rather than fight it. You remember the darkness, the quiet, the slow passage of time measured by breath and hunger and attention. Those memories don't haunt you. They steady you. There's a calm that comes from knowing you can disappear when necessary, that you don't always have to perform endurance outwardly, that survival can happen invisibly, patiently, beneath notice. As you move forward, you carry that calm with you, into work, into planning, into the way you face uncertainty. The lesson extends beyond winter. Sometimes the strongest response is not to push harder, but to step back, to reduce exposure, to wait until conditions change. You learned that beneath the frost, and even now, long after you've left the shelter behind, the earth continues to hold that knowledge quietly, ready if you ever need it again. Now, as the story begins to soften and drift, you let yourself rest with the memory of stillness, not the sharp stillness of fear, but the gentle kind that comes after endurance has done its work. You picture the earth again, steady and patient, holding warmth just long enough to matter. Your breathing slows without effort. Each breath feels unhurried, full and calm. There is no storm pressing in now, no decision waiting to be made, only the quiet reassurance that you already know how to wait when waiting is required. You don't need to replay every detail. The body remembers what matters. The mind can let the rest fade. If your eyes are still open, you allow them to grow heavy. If they're already closed, you let the darkness deepen comfortably. Without tension, thoughts loosen, edges soften. Time stretches gently instead of pulling. The earth beneath the story feels warm now, no longer cold or demanding. Just present, just enough. You've traveled through winter and back again. There's nothing left to prove. Nowhere else to go tonight. You're safe to drift. Let the quiet take over. Let the rhythm of breath replace words. Let sleep arrive the way warmth did underground, slowly, patiently, and without force. Sweet dreams.